Lev Nikolayevich Tolstoy was born on August 28, 1828, at Yasnaya Polyana, an estate about 120 miles south of Moscow. His family belonged to the highest tier of Russian nobility. His mother, Princess Maria Volkonskaya, died when he was not yet 2 years old. His father, Count Nikolai Tolstoy, died when Lev was 9. These early losses shaped his lifelong preoccupation with death and meaning. Orphan children of the aristocracy did not suffer materially. Tolstoy inherited substantial wealth and land. He was raised by aunts and tutors in a world of servants, French governesses, and the unquestioned privileges of his class. He enrolled at Kazan University in 1844 to study Oriental languages, then law, but found academic life tedious and left without a degree. He returned to Yasnaya Polyana in 1847, intending to improve the lives of his serfs. The experiment failed, the peasants distrusted him, and he lacked the discipline to see it through. The next years followed a pattern common among wealthy young Russian men. Tolstoy gambled, drank, visited brothels, and accumulated debts. He traveled to Moscow and St. Petersburg, seeking purpose in society and pleasure. In 1851, his older brother Nikolai, serving in the Caucasus, invited him south. Tolstoy joined the army, participating in raids against Chechen fighters. He began writing during this period. His first published work, Childhood, appeared in 1852 in the literary journal The Contemporary. It was an immediate success. Tolstoy served in the Crimean War from 1854 to 1855, stationed at the besieged fortress of Sevastopol. He witnessed the chaos and absurdity of military bureaucracy, the suffering of common soldiers, and the disconnect between official reports and ground reality. These experiences fed his later pacifism. His Sevastopol sketches, published during the war, earned him recognition as a major literary voice. After leaving the army in 1856, Tolstoy traveled through Europe. He visited Germany, France, Switzerland, and Italy. He observed Western societies with a critical eye, unimpressed by their industrialization and bourgeois values. He briefly considered emigrating but returned to Russia in 1861. That same year, Tsar Alexander II emancipated the serfs. Tolstoy served as an arbiter of the peace, mediating disputes between landowners and newly freed peasants. He sided with the peasants more often than his peers appreciated. In 1859, Tolstoy opened a school for peasant children at Yasnaya Polyana. He rejected the rigid methods of traditional education, allowing students to learn at their own pace and pursue their interests. He published an educational journal and wrote textbooks. The school closed in 1862, but his ideas about education remained central to his philosophy. In September 1862, at age 34, Tolstoy married Sofia Andreyevna Bers, who was 18. She came from a cultured Moscow family. The marriage began with genuine affection. Sofia managed the estate, copied his manuscripts, and bore him 13 children, of whom 8 survived to adulthood. The early years of their marriage were Tolstoy's most productive literary period. Between 1865 and 1869, he wrote War and Peace. The novel was published serially and made him internationally famous. It combined historical narrative with philosophical inquiry, following 5 aristocratic families through the Napoleonic Wars. The book questioned the role of great men in history and suggested that historical events emerge from countless small decisions by ordinary people. In 1873, Tolstoy began Anna Karenina, completing it in 1877. The novel explored marriage, adultery, social convention, and the search for meaning. The character of Konstantin Levin, a landowner struggling with existential questions, was partly autobiographical. While writing Anna Karenina, Tolstoy experienced increasing religious doubt and despair. By 1879, Tolstoy had entered a profound spiritual crisis. Despite having everything society deemed valuable, wealth, fame, a large family, artistic achievement, he found life meaningless. He contemplated suicide. The question that paralyzed him was simple: why live? What is the point of any action if death annuls everything? This crisis forms the subject of his book, A Confession, written between 1879 and 1880, though not published in Russia until after his death. Tolstoy sought answers in philosophy and science but found them inadequate. Science could describe how things worked but not why anything mattered. Philosophy offered intellectual games. He turned to the lives of ordinary people, peasants, laborers, and observed that they lived without the existential terror that plagued him. They had faith. Not the elaborate theological faith of church intellectuals, but a simple, lived faith that gave meaning to daily existence. This realization pushed Tolstoy toward religious study. He learned Greek and Hebrew to read the Gospels in their original languages. He concluded that Christianity, as practiced by the Russian Orthodox Church and other institutional churches, had corrupted Christ's actual teaching. The true message, he believed, was radical, simple, and focused on this life rather than the next. From 1880 onward, Tolstoy's life divided. He continued to live at Yasnaya Polyana with his family, but he adopted peasant dress, gave up hunting and meat, and began doing manual labor. He cobbled shoes, worked in the fields, and carried water. His wife found these changes baffling and threatening. His wealth remained, but he felt increasingly hypocritical living off it. He attempted to give away his property and relinquish the copyright to his works written after his conversion. Sophia resisted, concerned for their children's inheritance. Tolstoy wrote less fiction after his conversion and focused on religious and philosophical tracts. His book The Kingdom of God is Within You, published in 1894, outlined his Christian anarchist philosophy. It influenced figures like Mahatma Gandhi, who corresponded with Tolstoy late in the writer's life. His moral authority grew even as the Russian government and Orthodox Church condemned him. In 1901, the Church officially excommunicated him. The final decade of Tolstoy's life was marked by increasing tension at home. Sophia grew resentful of his followers, who treated Yasnaya Polyana as a pilgrimage site. Tolstoy felt trapped between his ideals and his family obligations. In the early morning of October 28, 1910, at age 82, he left home secretly with his youngest daughter and a doctor. He fell ill during the journey and was taken off the train at Astapovo station. He died there on November 7, 1910, refusing to see a priest. Thousands attended his funeral. He was buried at Yasnaya Polyana without religious ceremony as he had requested. The crisis at 50, when everything lost meaning. In the late 1870s, Lev Tolstoy stood at the peak of worldly success. War and Peace had established him as one of Russia's greatest writers. Anna Karenina was appearing serially to critical acclaim. He owned a vast estate, enjoyed a large family, and had wealth that secured comfort for generations. By every external measure, he had won life's lottery. Yet during this period, he became convinced that life was utterly meaningless and seriously contemplated suicide. The crisis did not arrive suddenly. Tolstoy later described it as a growing horror that crept over him gradually. He was around 50 years old when it reached its climax. He would be working on his writing or managing estate affairs when a question would interrupt his thoughts. Why? Why am I doing this? What will it lead to? The questions paralyzed him. They made every action seem pointless. Tolstoy had always been prone to introspection and melancholy, but this was different. This was not sadness or disappointment with particular circumstances. It was a fundamental collapse of meaning. The question was not whether he was happy or successful, but whether anything at all mattered given the certainty of death. If he would die, if everyone he loved would die, if all his work would eventually be forgotten, what was the point of any effort? He described his state in A Confession, the account he wrote of this period. He compared himself to a man lost in a forest who climbs a tree to get his bearings. From the top, he sees only endless forest in all directions and no path home. Or he compared himself to someone clinging to a branch on a cliff, with dragons above waiting to devour him and an abyss below. He could not climb up or down. He could only hold on, knowing his strength would eventually fail. The most disturbing aspect was that this realization seemed like clarity, not delusion. Tolstoy felt he had finally seen through the distractions that keep people busy and glimpsed the truth. Individual human life is a brief, meaningless episode in an indifferent universe. Death waits for everyone. Time erases all accomplishments. Love ends. Beauty fades. Everything that seems important today will be forgotten. He could not escape these thoughts through work or distraction. When he sat down to write, the questions returned. Why write? So people will read it, and then they will die. And others will read it, and they will die too. Eventually, no one will read it. Eventually, the sun will cool and the earth will freeze. What does it matter if one more Russian novel exists or does not exist? Tolstoy hid the rope in his bedroom so he would not hang himself. He stopped carrying his gun on hunting trips because he did not trust himself with it. He was not sad in the conventional sense. He was not suffering from a specific loss or failure. He was simply staring into what he perceived as the void at the center of existence. He turned to science for answers. Science could tell him how the world worked, the mechanisms of biology and physics, but it could not tell him why any of it mattered. Science described processes but offered no meaning. It could explain that humans are biological organisms driven by evolutionary imperatives, but that explanation made life seem even more meaningless. If we are just machines for replicating genes, what is the point? He turned to philosophy. Socrates had said that wisdom consists in knowing that you know nothing. Schopenhauer argued that life is suffering and the only escape is to extinguish desire. Solomon, in Ecclesiastes, declared that all is vanity. Buddha taught that existence is suffering and the goal is to escape the cycle of rebirth. These thinkers confirmed what Tolstoy already felt. Life, viewed rationally, is pointless. Yet Tolstoy noticed something that troubled his despair. Most people did not seem to share his anguish. The peasants on his estate worked, raised families, celebrated, mourned, and died without apparent existential terror. They had something he lacked. When he examined this more closely, he realized they had faith. Not necessarily sophisticated theological positions, but a simple conviction that life had meaning given to it by God. Tolstoy tried to dismiss this as ignorance. Perhaps they had not thought deeply enough to see the void, but this explanation did not satisfy him. Many peasants endured hardships far greater than his and yet maintained joy and purpose. Meanwhile, he, with every advantage, wanted to die. Perhaps intelligence was not revealing truth, but obscuring it. Perhaps the rational mind, when it detached itself from life, saw only death and meaninglessness because it was looking at the wrong thing. He observed 4 types of responses to the meaninglessness problem among educated people in his social class. The first was ignorance. Some people simply never thought about it. They remained distracted by work, ambition, and pleasure until they died. The second was Epicureanism. Some acknowledged life's meaninglessness but decided to extract as much pleasure as possible in the time available. The third was his own response, recognizing the horror and considering suicide. The fourth was the response he had not yet chosen, living despite the meaninglessness through sheer force of will, simply because one is alive and has obligations. None of these satisfied him except possibly the fourth, but that required a strength he felt he lacked. He could not simply decide to find meaning. The conviction that life was pointless was not a mood he could dispel through willpower. It was a conclusion that seemed rationally unavoidable. Then he reconsidered the faith of common people. What if faith was not an intellectual position to be proven true or false, but a way of relating to existence? What if the question, why live, was itself the problem, a question that arose only when one stepped outside life to examine it abstractly? Those who lived meaningfully did not ask the question. They were inside life, participating in it, rather than standing outside trying to justify it. Tolstoy began to study religion seriously. Not the religion of priests and theologians, which seemed to him as abstract and lifeless as philosophy, but the religion embedded in how people actually lived. He read the Gospels. He tried to pray. He attended church services. Much of what he encountered in institutional religion repelled him. The rituals that seemed empty, the doctrines that seemed absurd, the church's alliance with wealth and power. But underneath it all, he found something that spoke to his condition, the teachings of Jesus, particularly the Sermon on the Mount. What struck him was that Jesus did not offer philosophical arguments about the meaning of life. Jesus offered commands. Love your enemies, turn the other cheek, give to those who ask, do not worry about tomorrow. These teachings pointed toward a way of living that did not require answering the question of life's ultimate meaning. They suggested that meaning was found in the doing, in the love, in the moment, not in some abstract justification. Tolstoy began to see his crisis not as the discovery of a truth, but as the result of a wrong question. Life does not have a meaning that can be stated in words and proven rationally. Life is meaning. To ask why live is like asking why is up. The question dissolves when you recognize that life is the precondition for all questions and answers, not something that itself requires justification. This realization did not come all at once. It developed over several years, and even when it came, it did not eliminate his struggles or doubts, but it redirected them. Instead of asking why live, he began asking how should I live? That question had answers. That question led somewhere. That question made action possible again. What is the meaning of life? Tolstoy's answer. After years of existential agony, Tolstoy reached a conclusion about life's meaning that was both simple and demanding. Life has meaning only when it is lived in harmony with the will of God, and the will of God is love. This was not a metaphor or poetic language for Tolstoy. He meant it as a practical truth that should govern every decision and action. The foundation of his answer rested on a distinction between 2 kinds of life: the personal, animal life of the individual body and the spiritual, universal life that connects all beings. The animal life seeks pleasure, comfort, and survival. It is concerned with eating, reproducing, acquiring property, protecting itself from threats. This life is inherently limited and temporary. The body ages and dies. All its acquisitions perish. Any meaning derived purely from satisfying bodily desires collapses when the body fails. The spiritual life, in Tolstoy's understanding, is participation in something infinite and eternal. It is not the life of the separate self, but of the self that recognizes its unity with all existence. This unity is God. God is not a being separate from the world who observes and judges from outside. God is the life force present in all things, the consciousness that experiences itself through every living creature. To live spiritually is to align oneself with this universal life rather than the narrow interests of the separate ego. This alignment requires love. Not romantic love or sentimental affection, but an active commitment to the welfare of others. Love means treating other people's needs as seriously as one's own. It means abandoning the illusion that you are fundamentally separate from others, that your interests conflict with theirs, that their suffering is not your concern. When you recognize that all life is one life, harming another is harming yourself. Helping another is helping yourself. Tolstoy argued that this is what Jesus taught. The command to love your neighbor as yourself is not an idealistic exaggeration. It is a statement of fact about the nature of reality. You are your neighbor in a deep sense. The boundaries between selves are less solid than they appear. What we call the self is mostly illusion, a product of identification with the temporary body. The true self is the life that animates all bodies. Human life gains meaning by serving this universal life. Serving it means living in such a way that life increases. More love, more kindness, more truth, more connection. It means reducing suffering where possible and refusing to add to it through violence, deception, or exploitation. It means seeing every interaction as an opportunity to either strengthen or weaken the bonds between living beings. This teaching implied specific rejections. First, Tolstoy rejected the idea that life's meaning could be found in personal happiness or pleasure. He had tried that path. It led nowhere. Pleasure fades, desires multiply, and the pursuit of satisfaction becomes a treadmill. Even if you succeed in acquiring everything you want, death takes it all. There is no lasting satisfaction in serving the animal life. Second, he rejected the idea that meaning comes from serving abstract entities like the nation, the race, the class, or historical progress. These concepts, he argued, are used to justify violence and exploitation. They ask individuals to sacrifice themselves and others for a collective that does not actually experience anything. Only individuals experience joy and suffering. The nation feels nothing. To harm a real person in the name of an abstraction is a fundamental error. Third, he rejected the church's teaching that meaning comes from believing correct doctrines and performing rituals that secure a favorable afterlife. This teaching, in Tolstoy's view, turns religion into a bargain. Behave correctly now and receive rewards later. It misses the point entirely. The meaning of life is not located in some future state after death. It is here, now, in how you relate to the life around you. Tolstoy insisted that his answer was not faith in the sense of believing unlikely propositions. It was recognition of what was already true. You do not need to believe that love is important. You only need to pay attention to how life actually works. When you love, you feel connected and alive. When you hate, you feel isolated and dead. When you help someone, something in you strengthens. When you harm someone, something in you weakens. These are observable facts. The problem is that society actively prevents people from seeing these facts. We are trained from childhood to identify with the separate self and its interests. We are taught to compete, to accumulate, to protect what is ours. We are organized into groups that define themselves against other groups. We are fed stories that justify violence and selfishness. We are distracted by entertainments that numb our awareness of how we actually feel. This entire structure obscures the truth that life gains meaning through love and loses meaning through separation. To live meaningfully, then, requires swimming against the current of society. It requires questioning every convention, every belief, every habit that serves the separate self at the expense of the universal life. It requires a kind of constant vigilance because the pull towards selfishness is strong and society reinforces it at every turn. Tolstoy also insisted that meaning is not something you possess or achieve once and for all. It is something you must generate continuously through action. You cannot find meaning and then relax. Every moment presents a choice. Will you act from love or from fear, from connection or from separation? The meaning of your life is the sum of these choices. This means that every person's life can have meaning regardless of their circumstances. You do not need to accomplish anything spectacular. You do not need to be famous, wealthy, or powerful. You need only to live in accordance with love as well as you can in whatever situation you find yourself. A peasant working in a field can live more meaningfully than a king conquering nations if the peasant works with love and the king acts from ego and violence. Tolstoy acknowledged that this answer would disappoint many people. It offers no guarantee of personal immortality, no promise that your individual consciousness will survive death. It does not explain why the universe exists or resolve all philosophical puzzles. It does not provide a plan for reforming society or ending suffering permanently. It simply says, you are alive, you are connected to all life, act from that connection, and your life will have meaning. For Tolstoy, this was enough. The question, what is the meaning of life, loses its terror when you stop looking for an abstract answer and start living the answer. The meaning of life is not something you discover. It is something you create through how you love. The kingdom of God is within you. Christianity without the church. In 1884, Tolstoy published What I Believe, one of several books elaborating his religious views. The Russian government immediately banned it. In 1894, he published The Kingdom of God is Within You, which expanded these ideas into a comprehensive critique of institutional Christianity and outline of his own understanding of Jesus' teaching. This book too was censored in Russia, but circulated widely in other languages. In 1901, the Russian Orthodox Church formally excommunicated him, declaring him a heretic. Tolstoy responded that he had already rejected the church years earlier. Tolstoy's central claim was that Christianity, as practiced by churches, was a massive distortion of what Jesus actually taught. The church had taken a radical message of love and nonviolence and transformed it into a religion of rituals, hierarchies, and alliances with state power. It had replaced the living teaching with dead formalism. Most people who called themselves Christians, Tolstoy argued, had never seriously engaged with Jesus' actual words. They attended services, performed rituals, and believed doctrines, but their lives remained unchanged. They supported violence, accumulated wealth, and treated others according to social hierarchies rather than universal love. The title of his book came from Luke 17:21, where Jesus tells the Pharisees that the kingdom of God does not come with observation, and the kingdom of God is within you. Tolstoy took this as the key to understanding Jesus' entire message. Jesus was not promising a future kingdom after death or at the end of history. He was pointing to a present reality. The kingdom of God is the condition of consciousness that arises when you live according to love. It is not a place, it is a state of being. It is available now to anyone who chooses to enter it by aligning their will with God's will. Tolstoy read the Gospels with fresh eyes, attempting to strip away centuries of theological interpretation. He learned Greek to read the original texts. He concluded that much of what churches taught was not in the Gospels at all, or directly contradicted them. The church emphasized Jesus' divinity, his miracles, his sacrificial death, and his resurrection as cosmic events. Tolstoy found these doctrines unimportant at best and misleading at worst. They turned Jesus into a supernatural figure whose teachings applied only to a special dispensation, not to ordinary life. What mattered in Tolstoy's reading was the Sermon on the Mount, particularly 5 specific commandments he identified as the core of Jesus' teaching. First, do not be angry. Reconcile with others before conflicts escalate. Second, do not commit adultery even in your heart. Third, do not swear oaths. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Fourth, do not resist evil with violence. Turn the other cheek. Fifth, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. These commandments were not suggestions for saints or ideals to aspire toward. They were practical instructions for living. Tolstoy believed that if people actually followed them, they would create the kingdom of God on earth. The reason they seemed impossible or impractical was that no one tried. Churches declared them beautiful but unrealistic. Theologians explained them away as hyperbole. Political leaders ignored them entirely. And so the world continued in violence, exploitation, and suffering. The church, in Tolstoy's analysis, had betrayed Jesus from its earliest days. When Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine, it gained temporal power but lost spiritual truth. It blessed armies, crowned emperors, and accumulated wealth. It developed elaborate hierarchies that mirrored worldly power structures. It claimed exclusive access to salvation and used this claim to control populations. It burned heretics, waged crusades, and aligned itself with every oppressive political regime. This betrayal was not accidental. The church had to distort Jesus' teaching in order to serve power. Jesus commanded non-violence. The church had to bless violence to serve kings and emperors. Jesus commanded that no one take oaths. The church had to modify this to allow citizens to swear loyalty to rulers. Jesus commanded giving to all who ask. The church had to reinterpret this to allow property and wealth to accumulate in Christian societies and in the church itself. The mechanism of distortion was theology. By making Jesus into God, the church could claim that his teachings were divine ideals not meant for ordinary people. By emphasizing salvation through faith and sacraments rather than through living according to Jesus' commands, the church could allow Christians to live exactly like non-Christians while still claiming religious identity. By promising heaven after death, the church could make religion about the next world rather than transforming this one. Tolstoy rejected all the sacraments. Baptism was unnecessary because the kingdom of God is already within you. Communion was symbolic at best, and the doctrine of transubstantiation was absurd. Marriage did not require church blessing. Confession to a priest was meaningless without genuine change of behavior. The priesthood itself was an illegitimate institution. Jesus had established no hierarchy. He told his followers they were all brothers and should call no man father or master. He also rejected the Nicene Creed and other doctrinal formulations. The Trinity was a philosophical puzzle, not a spiritual truth. The virgin birth, the bodily resurrection, the second coming, these were either legendary accretions or metaphors that should not be taken literally. What mattered was not what you believed about Jesus, but whether you followed his teaching. For Tolstoy, prayer did not mean asking God for favors or reciting formal prayers. It meant aligning your will with God's will. The Lord's Prayer, which Jesus gave as a model, asks for daily bread, forgiveness, and protection from temptation. It does not ask for wealth, success, or harm to enemies. True prayer is recognition that your life is not your own, but belongs to the universal life, and that you will try to act accordingly. The kingdom of God within you emerges when you stop living for the separate self and start living for love. This is a decision you can make at any moment. You do not need a priest to mediate. You do not need to wait for death. You do not need to believe correct doctrines. You need only to stop doing evil and start doing good. Stop hurting others. Stop lying. Stop accumulating more than you need. Start helping. Start forgiving. Start loving. Tolstoy acknowledged that this sounded simple to the point of naivety. People would object that society could not function on these principles. If you turn the other cheek, evil people will dominate. If you give to all who ask, you will have nothing. If you refuse to swear oaths, the legal system collapses. If you will not fight, your country will be conquered. His answer was that society as currently constituted is already hell. It runs on violence, deception, and exploitation. It produces wars, poverty, and oppression. The fact that following Jesus' teaching would disrupt this system is not an argument against the teaching. It is proof that the teaching addresses the root of the problem. The kingdom of God and the kingdom of man are incompatible. You cannot serve both. The excommunication by the Russian Orthodox Church in 1901 accused Tolstoy of denying Christ's divinity, mocking the sacraments, and rejecting the church's authority. The statement called on believers to pray for his repentance. Tolstoy published a reply in which he stated that he did indeed reject the church but not Christianity. He clarified that he believed in God as the source of all life, in Jesus as a teacher who revealed the truth about how to live, and in following Jesus' commandments as the path to salvation, understood as inner peace and connection with all beings. The church wanted submission. Tolstoy offered clarity about his position. He was not interested in reforming the church or creating a new sect. He simply wanted to follow Jesus' teaching as he understood it. Anyone else could do the same without needing his permission or guidance. The truth was available to anyone who read the Gospels without the distorting lens of church tradition. Universal love and the brotherhood of all humanity. For Tolstoy, love was not one virtue among many. It was the fundamental orientation that made all other virtues possible. Without love, what appeared as morality was merely convention or self-interest disguised. With love, even simple actions became sacred. His entire ethical system rested on the principle that all human beings are connected at a level deeper than their apparent differences, and this connection demands that we treat every person as ourselves. This was not sentiment. Tolstoy did not mean the warm feelings of affection that arise spontaneously toward people we like. He meant something more demanding, the active choice to regard the welfare of others as no less important than your own. You might not feel affection for someone who harms you or opposes you, but you must still recognize their life as equally valuable. Their suffering matters as much as yours. Their needs are as legitimate as yours. Love in this sense is not an emotion, it is a commitment. The basis of this commitment was Tolstoy's understanding of what a person actually is. He believed that people make a fundamental error when they identify themselves solely with their individual body and mind. This identification creates the illusion of being a separate, isolated entity whose interests naturally conflict with the interests of other separate entities. From this illusion flows all violence, all cruelty, all exploitation. If I am separate from you, your gain might be my loss. If I am separate, I must protect myself against you. If I am separate, your death is not my concern. But Tolstoy argued that this separateness is not ultimate reality. At a deeper level, the same life animates all living beings. This life is what he called God. God is not an entity outside the world, but the life within the world. When you look at another person, you are looking at another manifestation of the same life that experiences itself through you. To harm them is to harm that life. To help them is to serve it. This recognition generates what Tolstoy called the law of love. It is not a law imposed from outside by an authority. It is simply what follows from understanding what you are. If you see clearly that all beings share the same fundamental life, then treating others with love becomes as natural as taking care of your own body. You do not need arguments or incentives to avoid cutting your own hand. You just do not do it because it is your hand. When you see others as participants in the same life, the same logic applies. Love, thus understood, has no boundaries. It does not stop at family, tribe, nation, or race. These categories are real on one level. People do have particular relationships and histories, but they cannot define the scope of moral concern. The Russian peasant and the Chinese peasant are both human beings with the same capacity for joy and suffering. The Christian and the Muslim both live by the same life force. The criminal and the saint both have the same essential nature, however obscured it might be in one and manifested in the other. This universal scope directly contradicted the way human societies organized themselves. Every society divided people into insiders and outsiders. Insiders deserved protection, loyalty, and compassion. Outsiders were potential threats to be guarded against, exploited if useful, or destroyed if dangerous. Patriotism, racism, religious sectarianism, class consciousness, all these forms of identity relied on making some people matter more than others. Tolstoy rejected all such divisions. He refused to recognize patriotism as a virtue. Patriotism, he argued, was simply tribalism dressed in noble language. It meant preferring your own nation's interests over the interests of humanity. It led directly to war. Governments manipulated patriotic feeling to convince people to kill and die for abstract national interests that had nothing to do with their actual welfare. A Russian peasant had more in common with a German peasant than with a Russian aristocrat, but patriotism told him to kill the German and obey the aristocrat. He also rejected religious sectarianism. Most religious believers thought their religion was true and others false. They believed God favored their group and condemned others. This belief justified persecution, holy wars, and missionary campaigns that destroyed indigenous cultures. Tolstoy saw this as profoundly anti-religious. The essence of all genuine religion was the same: recognize the unity of all life and act from love. The specific myths, rituals, and doctrines that varied between religions were cultural expressions of this core truth, not competing truth claims. Similarly, he rejected class divisions. The wealthy and poor were not different types of people. They were people placed in different circumstances by an unjust social system. The wealthy were not more virtuous or capable. They simply inherited or seized advantages. The poor were not lazy or inferior. They were prevented from accessing the resources and opportunities monopolized by the wealthy. To treat people differently based on wealth was to mistake a social arrangement for a natural fact. Race was another false division. Tolstoy lived in a world where European colonialism justified itself through theories of racial hierarchy. Europeans claimed to represent a superior civilization, bringing enlightenment to inferior peoples. Tolstoy saw this as a transparent rationalization for exploitation. All human beings had the same fundamental nature. Cultural differences existed, but did not constitute a ranking of human worth. The practical implications of universal love were radical. If you love all people equally, you cannot participate in violence against any of them. You cannot go to war. You cannot support governments that wage war. You cannot work in industries that produce weapons. You cannot eat food produced through the suffering of others. You cannot accumulate wealth while others starve. The logic of love, followed consistently, required withdrawing cooperation from the entire structure of violence and exploitation that society rested upon. Tolstoy knew this sounded impossible. People would object that such a position left you powerless against evil. If you will not fight, others will dominate you. If you will not protect your own, your family will suffer. If you will not participate in normal economic activity, you will be impoverished. His answer was that the apparent power gained by abandoning love is illusory. Violence generates counter-violence. Wealth gained through exploitation creates resentment and instability. Nations built on conquest eventually collapse. Real power comes from love because love creates genuine bonds between people. A society based on love would not need armies or police because people would not threaten each other. It would not need laws and courts because people would voluntarily respect each other's needs. It would not need prisons because people would help each other rather than harming each other. This was not a fantasy of perfection. Conflicts would still arise. People would still make mistakes, but the structure of relationships would be fundamentally different. Critics pointed out that no such society existed. Tolstoy agreed, but he argued that this did not invalidate the principle. The fact that people consistently violate the law of love does not prove the law is false. It proves that people are living wrongly. The question is not whether love works in the sense of producing immediate material advantage. The question is whether it is true to the nature of reality. Tolstoy believed it was, and therefore the task was to live accordingly regardless of what others did. He also insisted that love did not mean passivity or acceptance of injustice. You could resist evil without using evil means. If someone tried to harm you, you did not have to cooperate. If a government commanded you to kill, you could refuse. If an employer exploited workers, they could withhold their labor. Nonviolent resistance was possible, and often more effective than violence because it did not generate the same spiral of retaliation. The brotherhood of all humanity was not something to be established through political reform or education. It was already true. People needed only to recognize it and live accordingly. Every interaction was an opportunity to either acknowledge or deny this brotherhood. When you lied to someone, you treated them as an object to be manipulated rather than as a fellow participant in the same life. When you helped someone, you acknowledged the connection. When you killed someone, you acted as if their life had less value than whatever goal you pursued through their death. Tolstoy's later life was an attempt to embody this principle. He opened his estate to visitors regardless of status. He answered letters from people all over the world seeking guidance. He gave away money to those who asked. He worked alongside peasants in the fields. None of this came easily. He struggled with anger, pride, and the desire for comfort. But he kept trying to align his actions with the law of love as he understood it. He saw this not as moral heroism, but as basic sanity. To live in opposition to the fundamental law of existence is insanity. To live in harmony with it is simply to live correctly. Love is not an addition to life. It is the recognition of what life is. Nonviolence as ultimate power. Tolstoy developed his philosophy of nonviolence independently, but it would become one of his most influential ideas. He argued that violence, even when used to resist evil, perpetuates the cycle of evil. The only way to break this cycle is to refuse participation in it entirely. This was not passive acceptance of wrong, it was active resistance through moral force rather than physical force. The foundation of his nonviolence was theological and practical. Theologically, he believed that using violence against another person violated the fundamental unity of all life. When you harm someone, you harm the divine life that manifests through them and through you. You cannot serve God through actions that destroy what God creates. Practically, he observed that violence produces predictable consequences. It generates resentment, justifies counter-violence, and creates endless chains of retaliation. Tolstoy identified 5 commandments from the Sermon on the Mount as the basis for nonviolent living. The 4th commandment, resist not evil, was central. The Greek word translated as resist not was antistenai, which means do not oppose with violence, do not meet force with force. Jesus illustrated this with specific examples. If someone strikes your right cheek, turn the other also. If someone sues you for your coat, give them your cloak as well. If someone compels you to go 1 mile, go 2 miles. Most Christians interpreted these passages as unrealistic ideals or metaphors. Tolstoy insisted they were literal instructions. Jesus meant exactly what he said. The reason Christians found it hard to accept was that following these instructions would require dismantling the entire social order built on violence and coercion. Governments rest on the threat of force. Armies exist to kill. Legal systems punish through violence. Property is protected by the willingness to use force against those who violate it. Tolstoy argued that all this violence is illegitimate. No person has the right to use force against another, no matter what justification is offered. The state claims a monopoly on legitimate violence, but this claim is false. Violence does not become righteous because a government performs it. Murder does not stop being murder when carried out by soldiers following orders. Theft does not become just when called taxation and performed by officials. The usual objection was that without violence, evil people would dominate. If good people refuse to fight, bad people will win. Society would collapse into chaos. Tolstoy had 2 responses. First, the assumption that violence prevents evil is questionable. History shows that violence most often serves those who are willing to use it most ruthlessly, which means it serves evil more than good. Second, the alternative to violence is not passivity, but active moral resistance. When Jesus said to turn the other cheek, he was not counseling helpless submission. He was offering a third way between violent resistance and passive acceptance. If someone strikes you and you strike back, you have accepted their terms. You have agreed that the interaction will be governed by force. If you cower and accept abuse, you have accepted their claim to dominate you. But if you turn the other cheek, you refuse both options. You remain standing. You do not grant them the power to make you respond with violence or fear. You show that their violence cannot control you. This requires courage. It is easier to fight or flee than to stand without violence. But Tolstoy argued it was the only response that could actually change the situation. Violence reinforces the logic of violence. Turning the other cheek introduces a new logic, one based on human dignity rather than physical power. It forces the aggressor to confront what they are doing as a moral choice rather than a tactical necessity. Tolstoy applied this principle systematically. He opposed all courts and legal punishment because they rest on violence. When someone commits a crime, the state responds by inflicting suffering on them through imprisonment or execution. This does not repair the harm done, it adds more harm. The proper response to wrongdoing is to help the person understand why their action was wrong and encourage them to change. This cannot be achieved through violence. He opposed all military service. Governments conscript young men and train them to kill on command. They teach that killing is honorable when done for the nation and criminal when done for personal reasons. This distinction is arbitrary. The conscript forced to shoot enemy soldiers is committing murder just as surely as if he shot his neighbor in a private dispute. The fact that millions participate in war does not make it less evil. It makes it evil on a massive scale. Tolstoy received thousands of letters from young men asking his advice about military conscription. Many faced imprisonment for refusing to serve. He always encouraged them to refuse. He told them that no external authority could force them to kill if they genuinely refused. The government could imprison them, but it could not make them pull a trigger. And their refusal, even if it led to punishment, would bear witness to the truth and might encourage others. He opposed capital punishment absolutely. Executing criminals was murder performed ceremonially by the state. It did not deter crime. It simply added more killing to the world. Tolstoy wrote essays describing executions he had witnessed, detailing the bureaucratic process by which living human beings were methodically killed. He wanted readers to see past the legal language and recognize the act for what it was, a group of people strangling another person to death. He opposed revolutionary violence as much as state violence. Many Russian radicals in his time argued that violence was necessary to overthrow the oppressive Tsarist regime. Tolstoy disagreed. Using violence to achieve social change meant accepting the premise that power comes from force. Even if revolutionaries succeeded in seizing power, they would then have to maintain it through violence, creating a new oppressive system. The Russian Revolution of 1917, which occurred after Tolstoy's death, confirmed his prediction. The Bolsheviks used violence to gain power and then used far greater violence to maintain it. The alternative Tolstoy proposed was nonviolent non-cooperation. If people simply refused to participate in institutions based on violence, those institutions would collapse. Governments depend on the obedience of populations. Armies need soldiers willing to fight. Courts need officials willing to enforce judgments. Tax systems need citizens willing to pay. If large numbers of people refused, the entire structure would fail. He acknowledged this would require suffering. Governments would punish those who refused to cooperate. People would lose jobs, property, and freedom. Some would die. But Tolstoy argued this suffering was already present in the existing system, just distributed differently. Soldiers died in wars. Workers were crushed by industrial systems. Peasants starved under exploitative economic arrangements. The suffering of nonviolent resistance would at least serve a purpose. It would expose the violence of the system and inspire others to withdraw their support. Tolstoy's clearest statement of his nonviolent philosophy appeared in The Kingdom of God is Within You, published in 1894. The book traced the history of Christian pacifism and detailed contemporary movements refusing military service. He argued that Christianity and violence were absolutely incompatible. A Christian could not serve in the military, work in arms production, or support governments that waged war. Any Christian who did these things was not actually following Christ, regardless of what doctrines they professed to believe. The book circulated widely despite being banned in Russia. It reached a young lawyer in South Africa named Mohandas Gandhi. Gandhi was struggling with how to resist racial oppression without using violence. Tolstoy's book provided the framework he needed. Gandhi began corresponding with Tolstoy in 1909. They exchanged letters about nonviolent resistance until Tolstoy's death in 1910. Gandhi called Tolstoy one of his greatest teachers and adopted many of his ideas, including the concept that nonviolent resistance requires more courage than fighting. Gandhi took Tolstoy's principles and applied them to mass political movements. In South Africa and later in India, he organized campaigns of civil disobedience against unjust laws. People refused to carry identity passes, refused to pay certain taxes, and deliberately violated laws they considered immoral. When police arrested them, they did not resist. When authorities beat them, they did not fight back. The campaign succeeded not through force but through moral power. The oppressors were forced to confront the injustice of their position when faced with victims who would not respond with violence. Martin Luther King Jr. studied both Tolstoy and Gandhi. He brought their philosophy of nonviolence to the American civil rights movement. King organized boycotts, sit-ins, and marches that exposed the violence of segregation. When police attacked peaceful protesters with dogs and fire hoses, television cameras broadcast the images worldwide. The violence of the system became visible. Public opinion shifted, laws changed. This was non-violent resistance accomplishing what violence could not. Tolstoy did not live to see these movements. He died believing his ideas had little impact. He was wrong. His articulation of non-violence as both a spiritual principle and a practical method provided intellectual and moral resources for some of the most important social changes of the 20th century. His insight that violence perpetuates itself while non-violence breaks the cycle proved correct in multiple contexts. Critics of non-violence often point to situations where it seems inadequate. What about defending yourself or others from immediate physical attack? What about Nazi Germany or other totalitarian regimes that systematically murdered those who resisted? Tolstoy's response would be that these extreme cases do not invalidate the principle. Even in the worst circumstances, responding with violence makes things worse. The Nazi regime was eventually defeated by military force, but the cost was tens of millions of deaths and the devastation of Europe. Whether a purely non-violent response could have prevented or limited the Holocaust is unknowable, but Tolstoy would argue that the cycle of violence that led to World War II began with earlier decisions to use violence to solve political problems. His deeper point was that violence is never actually effective in achieving the goals people claim for it. Violence can destroy and kill, but it cannot create justice, peace, or genuine security. Those things can only emerge from relationships based on respect and love. Every time you use violence, even with good intentions, you strengthen the logic that says power comes from force. Every time you refuse violence, even at great personal cost, you strengthen the logic that says power comes from moral courage and human solidarity. Tolstoy understood that most people would reject his position. He knew he would be called naive, impractical, and dangerous. He was all three if judged by the standards of a world organized around violence. But he believed the world was organized wrongly, and that someone had to demonstrate the alternative. If no one refused to participate in violence, the cycle would never end. Each generation would inherit war, oppression, and the assumption that these things were inevitable. His own commitment to nonviolence was tested repeatedly. The Russian government censored his books, monitored his correspondence, and harassed his followers. He could have fled to Europe, where he would have been safe. He stayed in Russia, using his fame as a shield for less prominent people who shared his views. When peasants were beaten by police, he wrote articles exposing the violence. When conscientious objectors were imprisoned, he publicized their cases. He did what he could without using force. Toward the end of his life, as tensions increased in Russia and revolutionary violence grew more common, some former admirers accused him of irrelevance. They said his philosophy of love and nonviolence belonged to an earlier era. Modern political realities required harder methods. Tolstoy replied that the modern political realities were precisely why his philosophy was necessary. The logic of violence was leading toward catastrophe. He did not live to see World War I and the Russian Revolution, but he predicted both. He knew that a society built on violence would eventually tear itself apart. The simple life, labor, poverty, and true wealth. After his spiritual conversion in the late 1870s, Tolstoy began to radically alter how he lived. He adopted peasant clothing, simple linen shirts, and loose trousers instead of the formal wear expected of a count. He gave up hunting, a sport he had loved. He stopped eating meat. He began doing physical labor on his estate, working in the fields, carrying water, and chopping wood. He learned to cobble shoes and made a pair for himself. He cleaned his own room and carried out his own chamber pot, refusing the services of household staff. These changes were not eccentricities. They followed from his philosophy. Tolstoy had concluded that the lifestyle of the wealthy classes was based on exploitation. Rich people lived in comfort because poor people worked to sustain them. This arrangement was immoral. If you believed all people were equal, you could not justify living off their labor. The only honest way to live was to provide for yourself through your own work and to limit your needs to what you could produce or afford through fair exchange. His rejection of luxury was partly a rejection of what luxury represented. Expensive possessions signaled social status. They created artificial distinctions between people. They consumed resources that could meet real needs. A man did not need an elaborate wardrobe, a large house, or rich food. These things were vanities that fed the ego and separated him from ordinary people. They also required a supporting system of servants, suppliers, and workers whose labor maintained the infrastructure of comfort. Tolstoy observed that wealthy people rarely understood where their comfort came from. They ate food without thinking about who grew it. They wore clothes without considering who made them. They lived in houses cleaned by invisible servants. This disconnection allowed them to ignore the exploitation their lifestyle depended on. By doing his own labor, Tolstoy forced himself to confront the actual work required to sustain life. Chopping wood made him realize how much energy went into heating his house. Carrying water showed him what servants did every day without recognition. Physical labor had spiritual value as well. Tolstoy found that working with his hands quieted his mind and connected him to immediate reality. Philosophical and theological speculation could become abstract and sterile. When you were sweating in a field, existence was concrete. You were a body among other bodies doing necessary work. This was honest in a way that sitting in a study writing about truth was not. Jesus had been a carpenter. His disciples were fishermen and laborers. They knew life through direct engagement, not through texts and theories. The Simple Life also addressed Tolstoy's concern about time. Wealthy people filled their days with trivial activities because they were freed from necessary labor. They attended social functions, pursued hobbies, and consumed entertainment. None of this touched the fundamental questions of existence. Meanwhile, the time and energy of the working classes were consumed entirely by the struggle to survive. They had no leisure for intellectual or spiritual development. By working to meet his own needs and limiting those needs, Tolstoy freed time for what mattered: reading, writing, thinking, and helping others. He rejected the economic system that structured Russian society. Serfdom had been legally abolished in 1861, but the economic reality had not changed fundamentally. Peasants still worked land they did not own, paying rent to landlords. Factories in cities exploited workers for minimal wages. The economy was organized to extract labor from the many and concentrate wealth in the hands of the few. Tolstoy saw this as institutionalized theft. He became particularly critical of private property and land. Land, he argued, was not created by anyone. It existed before humans and would exist after them. No one had a right to claim exclusive ownership of it. The institution of private land ownership allowed some people to charge others for access to what should be common to all. A landlord produced nothing but collected rent from those who did produce. This was parasitism justified by legal fictions. Tolstoy was influenced by the American economist Henry George, who argued that land value came from community development rather than individual effort. As towns grew and populations increased, land values rose. The landowner profited from this increase without contributing to it. George proposed a single tax on land value to capture this unearned increment for public benefit. Tolstoy found this idea compelling, but believed the problem went deeper. Property itself was the issue, not just how it was taxed. He tried to give away his property. This created immense conflict with his wife, Sophia. She argued that he had no right to impoverish their children. The estate was their inheritance. His royalties from books supported the family. He could pursue spiritual ideals, but he should not impose poverty on others who had not chosen it. The conflict was never fully resolved. Tolstoy eventually relinquished copyright on works written after his conversion, making them freely available to anyone who wanted to publish them. But he did not succeed in giving away the estate or the income from his earlier works. This failure haunted him. He preached the simple life but continued to live in a large house with servants. He wrote about refusing to participate in exploitation, but benefited from systems he condemned. His critics called him a hypocrite. He agreed. In his diaries and letters, he acknowledged the gap between his ideals and his reality. He saw himself as weak, unable to fully commit to what he knew was right. This self-criticism was genuine, not false modesty. Yet he continued to advocate for the simple life despite his personal failures. He argued that the principle was correct even if he could not fully live it. The fact that he struggled to escape the system did not mean the system was acceptable. He was caught in structures built over generations. Dismantling them in one lifetime was difficult, perhaps impossible. But that difficulty did not change what was true. Tolstoy believed that most human suffering came from false needs. People thought they needed things they did not actually need. Advertising, social pressure, and cultural narratives created desires for products and experiences that added nothing to genuine well-being. The pursuit of these false needs consumed human energy that could be directed toward meaningful activities. It also drove the exploitation of labor and resources as industries manufactured and marketed unnecessary goods. True wealth, in his view, was having what you needed and being content with it. A person who had enough food, adequate shelter, and meaningful work was wealthy, even if they had no money. A person who had millions but always wanted more was poor, enslaved by insatiable desire. Freedom came from simplifying your needs to the point where you could meet them yourself or through fair exchange with others. This did not mean embracing asceticism for its own sake. Tolstoy was not interested in self-mortification or proving spiritual superiority through deprivation. The point was to remove obstacles to living rightly. Luxury and excess were obstacles. They distracted you from what mattered and tied you to systems of exploitation. By removing them, you freed yourself to focus on love, truth, and service. He also believed the simple life was better for physical and mental health. Wealthy people often suffered from ailments caused by overeating, lack of exercise, and sedentary habits. Peasants who worked outdoors and ate simple food were generally healthier, despite their poverty. Tolstoy's own health improved when he began doing physical labor and eating a vegetarian diet. He had more energy and felt more alive at 60 than he had at 40. The simple life was accessible to everyone. You did not need to be educated or talented. You did not need special training. You simply stopped pursuing what you did not need and started doing what was necessary. This democratic aspect appealed to Tolstoy. His philosophy did not require exceptional people. It required ordinary people making ordinary choices differently. Critics argued that if everyone lived simply, economic growth would stop. Industries would collapse. Modern civilization depended on consumption. Tolstoy replied that modern civilization, as constituted, was the problem. An economic system that required constant growth and endless consumption was inherently unsustainable. It treated the earth as an infinite resource to be extracted and people as units of labor to be exploited. A sane system would aim for sufficiency rather than growth, for meeting real needs rather than manufacturing artificial ones. He recognized that individual choices alone could not transform society. Even if many people adopted the simple life, structural injustices would remain. But he believed personal transformation was the necessary starting point. You could not create a just society while living unjustly yourself, and your example might inspire others. If enough people withdrew from systems of exploitation, those systems would lose their foundation. Tolstoy's vision of the simple life was not about returning to some idealized past. He did not romanticize peasant life or ignore its hardships. He knew poverty was brutal. What he advocated was voluntary simplicity combined with education and spiritual awareness. People should live simply not because they were trapped in poverty, but because they chose to reject wealth built on exploitation. They should do physical labor not because they were denied intellectual opportunities, but because they recognized the value of honest work. In his final decade, Tolstoy's home became a destination for pilgrims seeking guidance. People from Russia and abroad came to Yasnaya Polyana to meet the famous writer and hear his ideas. Many expected a saint. They found an old man still struggling with his contradictions, still living in a manor house while preaching simplicity, still supported by servants while advocating self-sufficiency. Some were disappointed. Others understood that his willingness to admit his failures was itself a teaching. The simple life was not easy. It required constant effort, but it remained the right direction to move. The State as Violence, Tolstoy's Anarchism. Tolstoy was an anarchist, though he rarely used the term. He believed that all governments, regardless of their form, were illegitimate because they were based on violence. The state claimed the right to compel obedience through threat of force. This right, in Tolstoy's view, did not exist. No person or group had the authority to coerce another. The fact that millions of people accepted state authority did not make it legitimate. It simply meant that millions of people had been taught to submit to power. His anarchism followed directly from his interpretation of Christianity. Jesus commanded his followers to love their enemies, turn the other cheek, and resist not evil with violence. These commands were incompatible with state power. The state survived by doing precisely what Jesus forbade, using violence against those who disobeyed, maintaining armies to fight enemies, and resisting challenges to its authority with force. A Christian could not serve the state without abandoning Christianity. Tolstoy traced the development of government to primitive times when stronger groups dominated weaker ones through force. Over centuries, these arrangements became institutionalized. Rulers claimed various justifications for their power: divine right, social contract, popular sovereignty. But underneath every justification was the same reality: the state would kill you if you challenged it sufficiently. All the elaborate structures of law, bureaucracy, and democracy disguised this fundamental violence. Democratic governments, in his analysis, were not fundamentally different from autocracies. They created the illusion that people governed themselves through elected representatives, but this was false. Citizens voted for candidates chosen by political parties, then those representatives made decisions that citizens had no direct control over. Meanwhile, the machinery of violence, police, courts, prisons, military, operated continuously regardless of election outcomes. A democratic state still imprisoned people for victimless crimes, still conscripted young men to fight wars, still seized property through taxation. The state justified its violence through the concept of law. Laws were presented as neutral rules that protected everyone equally. Tolstoy rejected this. Laws protected the interests of those who made them, which meant the wealthy and powerful. Property laws protected those who had property. Contract laws enforced agreements that typically favored those with more resources. Criminal laws punished behaviors that threatened the existing order while ignoring the structural violence inherent in that order. He saw the legal system as particularly pernicious because it made violence appear legitimate. When a robber steals from you, it is clearly theft. When the government takes your property through taxation, it is called law enforcement. When one person kills another, it is murder. When the state executes someone, it is called justice. The law transformed identical actions into their opposites simply by performing them through official procedures. Courts and prisons embodied this hypocrisy. Judges wearing robes and sitting in elevated positions pronounced judgments on those who broke laws. Those convicted were sent to prisons, where they were locked in cells, sometimes for years or decades. Guards watched them constantly. Attempts to escape were punished. Some prisoners were executed. All this violence was performed calmly, legally, with careful documentation. Tolstoy argued that the criminal in the dock was often less guilty than the system judging him. The criminal might have stolen because he was desperate. The system stole systematically through legal mechanisms. He applied the same analysis to war. Wars were mass murder performed by governments. Young men who would never think of killing a stranger in peacetime were trained to do exactly that in war. They were taught that killing was honorable when done for the nation and criminal when done for personal reasons. This distinction was arbitrary. Murder did not stop being murder because you wore a uniform and followed orders. Governments claimed wars were necessary to protect the nation. Tolstoy saw through this. Wars served the interests of rulers and wealthy elites, not ordinary people. Peasants and workers gained nothing from territorial conquests or geopolitical victories. They died in trenches, returned wounded, or lost family members. Meanwhile, those who started wars remained safe, and those who profited from military contracts grew rich. The state also claimed to provide security and order. Without government, anarchism's critics argued, society would descend into chaos. People would kill and rob each other. The strong would dominate the weak. Tolstoy's response was that this description already characterized life under government. States killed millions in wars. Police forces routinely brutalized citizens. Legal systems imprisoned people for minor offenses while allowing major criminals to operate freely if they had money and connections. Real security came from moral relationships between people, not from armed forces. In a society where people recognized their fundamental unity and lived according to love, violence would decrease naturally. People would not need police to prevent crime because they would not want to harm each other. Conflicts would be resolved through discussion and mediation, rather than through courts imposing judgments backed by threat of force. Tolstoy acknowledged that such a society did not exist, but he argued that it never would exist as long as people continued to believe that government was necessary. The state perpetuated the very violence it claimed to prevent. It taught people that problems were solved through force. It organized society around hierarchy and dominance. It normalized violence by making it legal. As long as this structure remained, genuine peace and justice were impossible. His anarchism was not the bomb-throwing revolutionary anarchism of some of his contemporaries. He opposed revolutionary violence as much as state violence. Seizing power through force to abolish the state was self-contradictory. If you used violent means, you would create a violent result. The Russian revolutionaries who claimed to fight for justice while assassinating officials were simply reproducing the logic of the system they opposed. The path to a stateless society was through individual refusal to participate in state violence. If enough people refused military service, armies would collapse. If enough people refused to pay taxes used for war and oppression, governments would lose funding. If enough people refused to serve as police officers, judges, and prison guards, the apparatus of state coercion would fail. This required courage because the state punished those who refused, but it was the only path that did not perpetuate violence. Tolstoy had no detailed plan for how society would organize itself without states. He was not interested in blueprints for utopia. His point was simpler: government was illegitimate, and Christians could not participate in it. What would replace it would emerge from people living according to the law of love. He trusted that human beings, if freed from the corrupting influence of power structures, would find ways to cooperate and meet their needs. Critics called this position naive. Human nature, they argued, was inherently selfish and aggressive. Without government to restrain these impulses, people would revert to a war of all against all. Tolstoy replied that this view of human nature was itself a product of living under governments. People learned selfishness and aggression from societies organized around competition and violence. In different conditions, with different models, they would develop different behaviors. He pointed to examples of cooperation and mutual aid in peasant communities. Villages often held land in common, made decisions collectively, and helped members in need. This was not because peasants were morally superior, but because their conditions encouraged cooperation. Similarly, he noted that the happiest and most functional human relationships, between friends, within families, were not based on coercion. People cooperated voluntarily when they recognized their interdependence. The state, by contrast, corrupted relationships. It turned citizens into subjects, neighbors into potential informants, and common resources into contested property. It created hierarchies that destroyed equality and used propaganda to justify its violence. Every child raised under government was taught to obey authority, to respect power, to accept that some people had the right to command others. This indoctrination shaped personality and worldview from the earliest age. Tolstoy's anarchism extended to economic relationships. He rejected capitalism not only because it concentrated wealth, but because it required state violence to function. Private property in land and capital could only be maintained through laws enforced by police and courts. Without these mechanisms, workers would simply refuse unfair arrangements and use resources directly to meet their needs. Capitalism and the state were interdependent. Both had to be rejected. He also rejected socialism as practiced by revolutionary movements. Socialists wanted to seize state power and use it to redistribute wealth and reorganize production. Tolstoy saw this as keeping the structure of domination while changing who occupied positions of power. A socialist state would still be a state, still based on violence, still corrupting those who wielded power. The workers' state would eventually become indistinguishable from the capitalist state it replaced. His final position was that no one should seek power over others, and no one should submit to power. Every relationship should be voluntary. Every association should be based on mutual agreement. Conflicts should be resolved through persuasion, not force. This vision struck many as impossibly idealistic, but Tolstoy insisted it was simply the logical conclusion of taking Christianity seriously. If you believed in love and nonviolence, you could not support institutions built on their opposites. In the final years of his life, as Russia moved toward revolution, Tolstoy watched with dismay. Both the autocratic government and its revolutionary opponents relied on violence. The government imprisoned, exiled, and executed dissidents. Revolutionaries assassinated officials and planned armed insurrection. Tolstoy saw no principle at stake, only a struggle for power. He predicted correctly that revolution through violence would lead to dictatorship. His own relationship with the state remained tense until his death. The government censored his religious writings but did not imprison him, partly because his international fame made him difficult to silence. When he died in 1910, the state conducted surveillance of his funeral to prevent it from becoming a political demonstration. Thousands came anyway, mourning a man who had insisted that truth was higher than power and that no government deserved obedience if it commanded evil. The slavery of modern civilization. Tolstoy looked at the world of the late 19th century and saw not progress, but a new form of slavery. The legal institution of serfdom had ended in Russia in 1861, and slavery had been abolished in the United States, but he believed these formal liberations masked a deeper bondage. Modern civilization, with its factories, cities, and economic systems, had created conditions that enslaved people more thoroughly than any ancient system, precisely because the chains were invisible. The essence of this slavery was that most people spent their lives doing work they did not choose, producing things they did not need, to earn money to buy survival from systems they did not control. A factory worker rose before dawn, traveled to a building where machines dictated the pace of his movement, performed repetitive tasks for hours, and returned home exhausted with barely enough wages to feed his family. He had no say in what he produced, no connection to the final product, no time for rest or development. His life was consumed by labor that served someone else's profit. This arrangement was presented as freedom. The worker was not legally owned by anyone. He could theoretically quit and find other work, but this freedom was illusory. He had to work or starve. Every factory offered similar conditions. The entire economic system was organized to extract maximum labor for minimum compensation. The worker's choice was not whether to be exploited, but only by whom. Tolstoy contrasted this with earlier forms of labor. A peasant working his own land decided when to plant and harvest. He saw the direct result of his effort in the crops he grew. His work followed natural rhythms and served his family's immediate needs. Even a serf bound to a master's estate had more autonomy than a factory worker. The serf's obligations were limited by tradition. The factory worker's obligations extended to every waking hour and were limited only by his physical capacity to continue. The industrial system degraded workers in multiple ways. It reduced them to interchangeable parts in a production process. Any worker could replace any other because the work required no skill or judgment, only obedience to machines. It destroyed their health through long hours, dangerous conditions, and poisonous materials. It separated them from their families, as both parents worked and children were left unattended or sent to work themselves. It deadened their minds by offering no intellectual stimulation or opportunity for creativity. Cities concentrated this misery. Tolstoy saw urban life as fundamentally unnatural and dehumanizing. Millions of people crowded into spaces designed for commerce and production rather than living. They breathed polluted air, drank contaminated water, and lived in cramped housing without light or ventilation. They were surrounded by noise and strangers. They had no access to nature, no connection to the earth, no experience of the silence and space necessary for reflection. The wealthy claimed they created employment opportunities and economic growth. Tolstoy saw this as rationalization. Factory owners grew rich from the labor of workers who remained poor. The more productive the factory, the greater the disparity. Technical innovations that should have reduced necessary labor instead intensified it, as owners used efficiency gains to produce more rather than to give workers time for rest and life. He also identified slavery in intellectual and professional work. Writers, journalists, and academics served power even when they thought themselves independent. They needed income, which came from publications, universities, or wealthy patrons. These funding sources had interests and preferences. Work that challenged existing power structures too directly would not be published or funded. So intellectuals unconsciously adapted their thinking to fit acceptable boundaries. They called this objectivity or professionalism, but it was self-censorship. The modern education system trained people for slavery. Schools did not teach children to think critically or live autonomously. They taught obedience, punctuality, and acceptance of authority. They prepared students to take their place in hierarchies where they would follow instructions and not question the structure. The curriculum focused on information useful for employment rather than wisdom useful for living. Students learned to compete with each other rather than cooperate, reinforcing the individualism that capitalism required. Science and technology, rather than liberating humanity, had become instruments of control. Trains and telegraphs allowed governments to move armies and transmit orders faster. Factories and machines increased production, but also increased the power of those who owned them. Medical advances primarily benefited the wealthy, who could afford treatment, while the poor died of preventable diseases caused by the conditions they worked in. Every technical innovation was absorbed into existing power structures and used to strengthen them. Tolstoy reserved particular criticism for money itself. Money was a social invention that allowed some people to command the labor of others without producing anything themselves. A landowner collected rent not because he worked the land, but because he held a legal title. A factory owner profited not because he assembled products, but because he owned the machines. A banker earned interest not because he created value, but because he controlled access to capital. All of these arrangements were enforced by law and presented as natural economic relations. The poor internalized their own oppression. They were taught that their poverty resulted from personal failure. If they worked harder, saved more, made better choices, they could improve their conditions. This was mostly false. The system was designed to concentrate wealth. Individual effort might allow a few to rise, but their rise depended on others remaining below. The structure itself ensured that most people would work their entire lives without security or comfort. Religion collaborated in this enslavement. Churches told the poor to accept their suffering as God's will and look forward to rewards in heaven. They preached patience, humility, and obedience to authority. They sanctified the existing order by claiming rulers received their power from God. This teaching served the powerful by pacifying the powerless. It transformed a message of liberation into a tool of control. Even apparent freedoms were illusory. Modern societies celebrated freedom of speech, but what could you say that mattered if no one with power listened? They celebrated freedom of the press, but who owned the presses and decided what to publish? They celebrated political freedom, but who could afford to run for office? And what could elected officials do against the economic powers that funded them? Tolstoy saw consumerism emerging as a new mechanism of control. As production increased, manufacturers needed people to buy more. Advertising created artificial desires. Fashion cycles made perfectly functional goods obsolete. Entertainment industries offered distractions from the emptiness of working life. People were encouraged to define themselves through what they purchased rather than how they lived. This kept them working to earn money to buy things they did not need, which kept them enslaved to the system. The cult of progress justified all this suffering. People were told that current hardships were necessary for future improvement. Industrial development would eventually raise living standards for everyone. Education would spread. Technology would solve problems. But Tolstoy observed that progress primarily benefited those already powerful. The rich became richer. The gap between classes widened. And the supposed benefits, more goods, more entertainment, more information, did nothing to address the spiritual emptiness and exploitation at the heart of modern life. He argued that civilization had inverted natural values. In a sane world, people would work to live. In modern civilization, they lived to work. In a sane world, technology would reduce necessary labor. In modern civilization, it intensified work. In a sane world, wealth would be distributed according to need. In modern civilization, it accumulated with those who already had more than they could use. The solution was not to reform capitalism or regulate industry more effectively. The entire structure was rotten. What was needed was withdrawal from the system to whatever degree possible. Stop buying what you do not need. Stop doing work that serves exploitation. Grow your own food. Make your own clothes. Educate your own children. Build communities based on cooperation rather than competition. Live simply and work with your hands. Tolstoy knew this advice seemed impractical to people trapped in cities, dependent on wages, with families to support. He acknowledged that escaping modern slavery completely was nearly impossible for most people. The system was too pervasive, too interlocking, but every step toward autonomy was valuable. Every reduction of dependence on money and markets was a small liberation, and the example of even partially free people might inspire others to question their bondage. He also insisted that the slavery of modern civilization was not inevitable. It was a human creation and could be changed by humans. The fact that it had existed for only a few generations proved it was not a permanent feature of existence. Before industrialization, people lived differently. After its collapse, which Tolstoy considered inevitable given its unsustainability, people would live differently again. The question was whether they would learn from the disaster and create something better, or simply reproduce the same patterns of domination under new names. His critique anticipated arguments that would emerge throughout the 20th century about alienation, consumerism, and the degradation of work. But Tolstoy made these arguments not from socialist theory, but from Christian ethics. Modern civilization was evil not because it violated economic principles, but because it violated love. It treated people as means rather than ends, as resources to be used rather than beings to be cherished. This was incompatible with recognizing the divine life in every person. Why progress is an illusion. The 19th century celebrated progress as an obvious and inevitable feature of history. Science advanced, technology improved, knowledge accumulated, and civilization spread. Educated people believed humanity was moving steadily toward enlightenment and prosperity. Tolstoy rejected this entire narrative. He argued that what was called progress was actually a movement away from truth, that technical advances masked moral and spiritual decline, and that much of what civilization celebrated was regression disguised as achievement. His skepticism about progress began with observation. The century had seen railroads, telegraphs, mechanized production, and countless other innovations. Yet most people were not happier or freer. Peasants who moved to cities for factory work lived in worse conditions than they had in villages. Workers who operated new machines worked longer hours for subsistence wages. Wars were more destructive because weapons were more powerful. The promised benefits of progress went to a small class while the majority suffered. Tolstoy distinguished between technical progress and genuine human progress. Technical progress meant improving tools and methods for manipulating the material world. This was real but limited. You could build faster trains, but that did not make people kinder. You could print more books, but that did not make them wiser. You could manufacture more goods, but that did not make life more meaningful. Technical capacity increased, while moral capacity stagnated or declined. He questioned whether even technical progress was unambiguously good. Every technology could serve either good or bad purposes. Railroads moved commercial goods, but also transported armies. The telegraph spread information, but also allowed governments to coordinate oppression across distances. Medical advances helped some, while the conditions of industrial work created new diseases. The net effect was ambiguous at best. Tolstoy was particularly critical of the progress narrative in morality and social organization. 19th century Europeans congratulated themselves on being more civilized than earlier ages or non-European peoples. They pointed to the abolition of slavery, the spread of literacy, and the establishment of democratic institutions. Tolstoy saw hypocrisy. Slavery had been replaced with wage labor that was often worse. Literacy was used to read newspapers full of lies and propaganda. Democratic institutions legitimized the same violence that monarchies had imposed. The claim of moral progress often meant that current practices were defended by reference to worse practices in the past. Modern war was said to be more humane than ancient war because there were some rules about treatment of prisoners. But modern war killed millions with industrial efficiency. Prison was said to be more humane than torture, but prisoners were still caged for years or decades, which Tolstoy considered its own form of torture. The comparison with worse alternatives did not make current practices good. He noted that the idea of progress encouraged complacency. If society was steadily improving, there was no urgency to address present evils. They would be resolved in time through the natural development of civilization. This attitude allowed people to tolerate injustice that they should have opposed immediately. It also meant that when things got worse, believers in progress simply denied the decline or explained it as a temporary setback in the overall upward trend. The theory of evolution, misunderstood and misapplied to human society, reinforced faith in progress. If biological life evolved from simple to complex forms, people assumed human society evolved from primitive to advanced forms. Europeans saw themselves as the pinnacle of this development and justified colonialism as bringing progress to backward peoples. Tolstoy rejected this reasoning. Different societies organized themselves differently, but that did not mean some were more evolved than others. Often, supposedly primitive peoples lived according to principles closer to Christian teaching than supposedly advanced Europeans. He also challenged the assumption that knowledge accumulated steadily. Ancient wisdom was often deeper than modern philosophy. The teachings of Buddha, Lao Tzu, and the authors of the Upanishads addressed questions that modern thinkers had forgotten how to ask. The Gospels contained truths that 18 centuries of Christian theology had obscured rather than clarified. Progress in specialized knowledge had come at the cost of wisdom about how to live. Tolstoy saw a pattern in history that contradicted the progress narrative. Civilizations rose, reached a peak of complexity and power, then collapsed into simpler forms. Rome conquered the Mediterranean world, built roads and aqueducts, established law codes, then fell to tribes it considered barbarian. The cycle repeated. There was no steady upward line, only rises and falls. The current civilization would also fall, likely because its internal contradictions made it unsustainable. The idea of progress was itself a relatively recent invention. Ancient peoples did not think history moved toward improvement. They looked to the past, to golden ages or founding heroes, as sources of wisdom and models for action. The Christian Middle Ages believed history moved toward the second coming and the end of the world, not toward human achievement. The secular faith in progress emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries alongside industrialization. It was ideology, not fact. This ideology served the interests of those who benefited from current arrangements. If society was progressing, then disrupting it was dangerous. Reformers and revolutionaries were interfering with natural development. The existing order, however unjust, was a stage in humanity's upward path. This reasoning justified conservative resistance to change. It also justified colonial exploitation as bringing progress to peoples who would otherwise remain backward. Tolstoy argued that real progress would mean moral and spiritual development. It would mean people learning to love more fully, to act less selfishly, to recognize their unity with all life. By this measure, there was no progress. People in the 19th century were as cruel, greedy, and violent as people in any other age. They simply had more powerful tools to express these qualities. A modern state could oppress more people more efficiently than an ancient tyrant, but the oppression was not less real. He offered an alternative to the progress narrative, the path of return. Instead of imagining a future that would be better through technical and social development, people should return to basic truths that had been obscured by civilization. These truths were accessible through direct experience, through attention to conscience, and through the teachings of spiritual masters. They did not need to be discovered through research. They needed to be remembered and practiced. The life that accorded with these truths was simpler than modern life, not more complex. It required less, not more. It focused on being rather than having, on present experience rather than future plans, on connection with others rather than individual achievement. This was not regression to some primitive past. It was moving toward what was genuinely human rather than what was merely technical. Tolstoy did not romanticize earlier periods. He knew the past included immense suffering, ignorance, and injustice. His point was not that the past was better, but that history did not follow a line of improvement. Different ages had different problems and different wisdom. The task was to learn what was true from any source and live accordingly, not to assume that chronological lateness equaled superiority. The faith in progress, he believed, would lead to catastrophe. Civilizations convinced of their superiority and certain of their trajectory became reckless. They pursued growth without limits, accumulated power without wisdom, and assumed problems could be solved through more of what created them. Eventually, the contradictions would become unmanageable. The system would collapse under its own weight. Tolstoy did not live to see World War I, which began 4 years after his death, but he predicted something like it. He saw European nations arming themselves with increasingly destructive weapons while claiming to serve progress and civilization. He saw diplomatic crises that nearly triggered wars being resolved temporarily, only for tensions to build higher. He knew that a system based on competition and violence would eventually produce a general catastrophe. His rejection of progress did not mean despair, it meant clarity. If you stopped believing that history would automatically improve, you could focus on what you could actually do, live rightly in the present. Progress was not something that happened to humanity as a whole through historical forces. It was something that happened to individual people who chose to align themselves with truth and love. This was possible in any age, under any conditions. It did not require technical advancement or social evolution. It required only courage and honesty. True education versus mass indoctrination. In 1859, Tolstoy opened a school for peasant children on his estate at Yasnaya Polyana. The school operated until 1862 and then briefly reopened in later years. It was unlike any other school in Russia. There were no grades, no standardized curriculum, no punishments, no mandatory attendance. Children came if they wanted to learn and left when they were satisfied. Teachers presented material but did not force students to study it. The classroom was chaotic by conventional standards, with students talking, moving around, and pursuing their own interests. Yet Tolstoy considered it the most successful educational experiment he ever witnessed. His approach to education grew from his broader philosophy. He believed that children were not empty vessels to be filled with knowledge or blank slates to be inscribed with culture. They were conscious beings with inherent dignity and curiosity. They had a natural desire to understand the world. The task of education was to support this desire, not to suppress it in favor of imposed learning. Conventional schools, in Tolstoy's observation, did the opposite. They treated children as raw material to be processed into useful members of society. They imposed discipline, demanded obedience, and measured success through standardized tests. They taught children what to think rather than how to think. They prepared students to take their place in hierarchical structures where they would follow orders and not question authority. This was not education, it was indoctrination. The method of conventional schools was coercion. Children were required to attend. They were forced to sit still, be quiet, and pay attention to topics they found boring. They were punished for disobedience or poor performance. They were rewarded for compliance and good grades. This system taught lessons that had nothing to do with the official curriculum. It taught that learning was unpleasant, that authority must be obeyed, that your value depended on how well you performed tasks set by others. Tolstoy rejected all coercion in education. At his school, children attended voluntarily. If they stopped coming, it meant the school was failing to interest them, not that they were lazy or undisciplined. Teachers had to make learning engaging enough that children chose to participate. This required creativity and attention to what actually interested students, not what a curriculum dictated they should learn. He observed that children learned most naturally through their own activity. They asked questions about what puzzled them. They experimented to see how things worked. They imitated what they saw others doing. They told stories and drew pictures to make sense of their experience. All of this was learning, but it looked nothing like sitting in rows listening to lectures and memorizing facts. Reading and writing were taught at Yasnaya Polyana, but not through formal phonics drills or grammar exercises. Children learned to read by reading things they wanted to read. They learned to write by writing about subjects that interested them. The process was slower than conventional methods, but the result was better. Students who learned this way actually enjoyed reading and wrote with genuine voice rather than imitating models. Mathematics was taught through problems that had practical relevance or intellectual interest, not through rote memorization of arithmetic tables. History was taught through stories that made the past vivid and raised questions, not through dates and names to be memorized for tests. Science was taught through observation and experiment, not through textbooks that presented conclusions without the process of discovery. Tolstoy found that children learned from each other as much as from adults. Older students helped younger ones. Students who understood something well explained it to those who were confused. This peer teaching was often more effective than teacher instruction because children could remember what had confused them and address those specific difficulties. It also built community rather than competition. The absence of punishment was central. Conventional schools used physical punishment, humiliation, and exclusion to enforce discipline. Tolstoy saw this as violence that taught children to fear and hate learning. At his school, misbehavior was addressed through conversation. If a student disrupted the class, the teacher would ask why and try to understand what the student needed. Often, disruption meant the student was bored or frustrated. The solution was different work, not punishment. Grades and tests were eliminated. These tools measured compliance and short-term memorization, not genuine learning. Students crammed for tests, then forgot the material. They competed for grades, which created anxiety and undermined cooperation. Tolstoy wanted students to learn for intrinsic reasons, because they were curious, because they found the material beautiful or useful, because learning itself was satisfying, not for external rewards. He also believed the content of conventional education was often worthless or harmful. Students memorized historical facts that taught them to revere wars and conquerors. They studied literature chosen to reinforce state ideology and social hierarchies. They learned geography that emphasized European superiority and colonial possessions. The curriculum served power, not truth. At Yasnaya Polyana, content emerged from students' questions and interests. If students wanted to learn about insects, they studied insects. If they wanted to learn about their own village's history, they investigated it. This meant different students learned different things, but all learned more deeply than students forced through a standardized program. Tolstoy published a journal about his educational theories and the Yasnaya Polyana school. He argued that peasant children had as much intellectual potential as aristocratic children, but were denied education that respected their dignity. Most schools for the poor taught just enough reading and arithmetic to make children useful workers, along with heavy doses of religious and political instruction designed to keep them obedient. He contrasted this with the education wealthy children received. They studied classical languages, philosophy, art, and science. They were taught to think critically and express themselves. They were prepared to occupy positions of authority. The educational system reproduced class structure by giving different classes different educations. True education, in Tolstoy's vision, would be the same for everyone. It would develop each person's capacity for thought, creativity, and moral judgment. It would teach practical skills, but also address fundamental questions about meaning and value. It would prepare people not to take predetermined places in a social hierarchy, but to live as autonomous, conscious beings. The Yasnaya Polyana school closed partly because government authorities suspected Tolstoy of revolutionary activity. They investigated the school and found its methods dangerously unconventional. How could society function if children were not taught obedience? How could order be maintained if the next generation did not accept authority? The authorities saw correctly that Tolstoy's educational philosophy threatened the existing order, though they misunderstood the nature of the threat. He was not training revolutionaries to overthrow the government. He was nurturing people who thought for themselves and therefore could not be easily controlled. Tolstoy believed that genuine education was subversive of all authoritarian structures. A person who learned to think independently would question laws, traditions, and beliefs that could not withstand scrutiny. A person educated to value truth over convention would not automatically obey. A person taught that all human beings had equal worth would reject hierarchies based on birth, wealth, or power. This was why governments and churches preferred indoctrination to education. His later writings on education emphasized that parents and communities should educate their own children rather than surrendering them to state schools. State education could never serve the child's true interests because the state's interest was producing obedient subjects and useful workers. Parents who wanted their children to be free, moral human beings had to take responsibility for their education. This did not mean parents had to be scholars or trained teachers. It meant they had to treat their children as people worthy of respect, answer their questions honestly, and provide access to books and experiences that stimulated growth. The best education happened through living with adults who were themselves engaged in meaningful work and moral reflection. Children learned by observing and participating, not by being lectured. Tolstoy acknowledged that his educational ideals were difficult to implement widely. Most parents had neither the time nor the resources to educate their children themselves. Economic necessity forced them to send children to schools, often to work, from an early age. This was another way the social system corrupted what should be natural. In a just society, families would have time for their children's development. The fact that they did not prove society was organized wrongly. Despite the difficulty, he insisted the principle remained valid. Every step toward genuine education and away from indoctrination was worthwhile. Even within state schools, teachers could treat students with more respect, answer questions more honestly, and create space for independent thought. Parents could supplement school with conversations that encouraged critical thinking. The goal was not perfection, but movement in the right direction. Near the end of his life, Tolstoy wrote a primer for teaching reading, which was published and widely used. Even in this simple textbook, his philosophy was evident. The stories were about peasant life, not aristocratic adventures. They taught moral lessons through example rather than preaching. They respected the intelligence of young readers and assumed they could understand complex ideas if presented clearly. His vision of education has influenced progressive educators throughout the 20th century, from John Dewey to contemporary advocates of democratic schooling and unschooling. The insight that genuine learning cannot be coerced, that children are agents of their own development, and that education should serve the person rather than the system remains relevant wherever schools replicate the authoritarian model Tolstoy opposed. What is real art? Art for the people. After his spiritual conversion, Tolstoy turned his critical attention to art, including his own artistic work. The result was What is Art?, published in 1897, one of the most controversial aesthetic treatises ever written. In it, he rejected most of what his contemporaries considered great art, including much of his own earlier work, and proposed a radically different standard for judging artistic value. Tolstoy began with a simple question: what is art for? The prevailing view among intellectuals was that art existed for beauty, for aesthetic experience, for its own sake. Art museums, concert halls, and theaters catered to educated elites who had the leisure and training to appreciate complex works. This entire structure seemed to Tolstoy fundamentally wrong. Art that served only a small class could not be truly important. If art had value, it had to be accessible to all people and serve a universal human purpose. He defined art as a means of communication. When an artist creates, they express a feeling or experience. When others encounter the work, they receive that feeling. Art succeeds when this transmission occurs genuinely. A song that moves listeners to feel what the composer felt is successful art. A painting that leaves viewers cold or confused regardless of its technical sophistication fails as art. This definition had radical implications. First, it meant that technical skill was not what made something art. A peasant song sung around a fire could be great art if it communicated feeling authentically. A technically perfect opera performance could fail as art if it did not move the audience. Second, it meant that accessibility was crucial. Art that required specialized education to understand was suspect. If common people could not receive the feeling, the communication had failed. Tolstoy divided art into two categories based on the feelings communicated. Religious art transmitted feelings that united people in a shared understanding of life's meaning. It reinforced the brotherhood of humanity and connection to the divine. Examples included the parables of Jesus, certain folk songs, and simple stories that conveyed moral truths. This was the highest art because it served the highest purpose, bringing people together in love and shared consciousness. Universal art transmitted feelings common to all people: joy in nature, love for family, grief at loss, courage in adversity. These feelings needed no special education to understand. A mother's love for her child was universal. A story expressing this love could move anyone. This art also had value because it reminded people of their common humanity across all boundaries of class, nation, and culture. Below these categories was what Tolstoy called counterfeit art. This included works that aimed to please the wealthy classes through novelty, cleverness, or sensuality rather than communicating genuine feeling. Much of contemporary literature, music, and visual art fell into this category. It was produced for critics and connoisseurs who judged it by specialized criteria that ordinary people did not share. It served vanity and exclusivity rather than human connection. He was particularly harsh on art that required extensive explanation or education to appreciate. If you needed to read critical essays to understand why a painting was good, it was probably not good. If you needed to study music theory to appreciate a composition, it failed as communication. If a novel required knowledge of literary traditions and sophisticated cultural references, it served only the educated elite and divided people rather than uniting them. Applying his own standards, Tolstoy rejected most of the artistic canon. Shakespeare was praised for his poetry and psychological insight, but his plays often glorified violence and aristocratic concerns. They were not accessible to peasants who had not studied them in school. Beethoven's late quartets were technically brilliant but emotionally obscure. They communicated nothing clear to most listeners. Much of Romantic poetry indulged in subjective feelings that had no universal significance. Even more controversially, Tolstoy rejected most of his own artistic work. War and Peace and Anna Karenina were novels for the educated classes. They were long, complex, and dealt with aristocratic life that peasants had no experience of. They were well written but did not serve the purpose art should serve. They were about his own class and intelligible primarily to that class. After his conversion, Tolstoy tried to write simpler stories with clear moral messages that anyone could understand and learn from. His late stories like The Death of Ivan Ilyich and How Much Land Does a Man Need exemplified his new approach. They had straightforward plots, characters from various social classes, and clear moral points about the vanity of worldly success and the importance of living rightly. They could be read aloud to illiterate peasants and understood immediately. They transmitted feelings about death, meaning, and human nature that were universally relevant. Tolstoy argued that the corruption of art mirrored the corruption of society. In a just world where people lived according to love and truth, art would naturally serve that life. It would express genuine religious feeling and common human experiences. But in a world dominated by wealth, power, and class divisions, art became another luxury good for the rich and a means of distinguishing themselves from common people. Galleries and opera houses were temples of class superiority disguised as culture. The art market reinforced this corruption. Wealthy patrons commissioned works that flattered their taste and confirmed their status. Critics and professors built careers interpreting difficult works, which gave them authority as guardians of culture. Art schools taught techniques but not truth. The entire institutional structure of art production and consumption served the existing social order rather than genuine human needs. He also criticized art that focused on individual subjective experience without moral content. Much modern art explored the artist's personal feelings, perceptions, and psychological states. Tolstoy found this self-indulgent. Art should communicate feelings that connected people to each other and to truth, not display the artist's unique sensibility. The cult of artistic genius and originality was another manifestation of individualism and vanity. Sexual and sensual art was particularly problematic. Art that aimed to excite the senses rather than elevate the spirit was at best trivial and at worst harmful. It reduced humans to their animal nature. Much of what was celebrated as passionate or romantic art was simply arousing base instincts. This included not only explicitly erotic art, but also music and literature that dwelt on romantic love as if it were the highest human experience. Tolstoy's critics accused him of Philistinism, of reducing art to propaganda, of valuing only crude, didactic work that preached obvious morals. They pointed out that by his standards, almost nothing in the museums and concert halls of Europe qualified as art. He accepted this criticism. If the great cultural achievements of civilization failed to communicate genuine feeling to ordinary people and serve the unity of humanity, then they were failures regardless of their reputation. He did not claim that technical skill or intellectual depth had no value. He claimed they were not sufficient for art and often interfered with art's real purpose. A simple folk song that everyone could sing and that expressed a feeling all could share was more valuable than a symphony that only trained musicians could perform and only educated audiences claimed to appreciate. The symphony might demonstrate impressive technical skill, but skill in the service of exclusivity and vanity was misdirected. Tolstoy offered examples of what he considered real art. The story of Joseph in Genesis communicated moral truths about forgiveness and divine providence through a narrative anyone could follow. Uncle Tom's Cabin, for all its literary flaws, transmitted the feeling of slavery's horror and moved readers to oppose it. Certain Christmas carols united people in shared celebration and religious feeling. These works might not satisfy sophisticated critical standards, but they achieved what art should achieve. He acknowledged that his theory would be unpopular among artists and critics whose careers and identities depended on the existing system. They would defend complex, exclusive art because it was their profession and their source of status. But this did not make them right. Most people throughout history had lived without access to high culture and did not suffer for it. What they needed was art that spoke to their experience and helped them live better, not art that marked class boundaries. The positive implication of Tolstoy's theory was that art could be created by anyone. You did not need training or talent in the conventional sense. You needed only a genuine feeling and the ability to communicate it. A mother singing to her child, a worker describing his experience in simple words, a peasant carving a wooden toy, all could be artists if what they made transmitted feeling authentically. Art was not the special province of a talented few, but a potential activity of all humans. This democratization of art threatened the cultural hierarchy. If peasant songs could be as valuable as operas, what justified the resources spent on opera houses? If simple moral tales could be as important as complex novels, what justified the prestige of literary criticism? Tolstoy's theory implied a complete revaluation of cultural production and consumption. Art should serve life, not the reverse. People should not organize their lives around consuming art produced by specialists. They should create and share art as part of ordinary living. Modern readers might find Tolstoy's aesthetic theory narrow and moralistic. He clearly rejected works that many people genuinely value. His emphasis on accessibility and moral content can seem to exclude valid forms of artistic exploration. But his core insight remains challenging. Much of what is called great art serves social distinction rather than human connection. The test of whether something is genuinely art is whether it communicates feeling that brings people together rather than separates them into those who understand and those who do not. His critique also applies to contemporary culture. The art world with its galleries, auction houses, and investment portfolios has little to do with communication of feeling and much to do with money and status. Popular entertainment often manipulates emotions for commercial purposes rather than expressing genuine experience. The boundaries between real art and counterfeit art that Tolstoy tried to define remain contested and important. Marriage, sex, and the impossible ideal. Tolstoy's views on marriage and sexuality were among his most controversial and conflicted positions. He was married to Sofia Andreevna for 48 years and had 13 children with her. Yet he came to believe that sexual relations, even within marriage, were at best a necessary evil and at worst a fundamental obstacle to spiritual life. His late work, the Kreutzer Sonata, published in 1889, scandalized readers by suggesting that humanity should aim for celibacy and eventual extinction of the species. The story tells of a man named Poznishev who murders his wife in a jealous rage after suspecting her of adultery with a musician. In long monologues, he explains how his marriage became a battlefield, how sexual desire poisoned their relationship, and how marriage as an institution is based on false premises. The narrative is disturbing, misogynistic in places, and clearly reflects Tolstoy's own marital struggles. Yet it also contains his serious philosophical position that sexual love is incompatible with Christian love. Tolstoy argued that romantic love, celebrated in literature and culture as the highest human experience, was actually a form of selfishness disguised as devotion. When a man claimed to love a woman romantically, what he really meant was that he desired her sexually and wanted to possess her. The elevated language of romance masked basic animal appetite. Poetry, music, and novels that celebrated passionate love were encouraging people to focus their lives around sexual gratification rather than spiritual development. Marriage was supposed to sanctify and domesticate this desire, turning it into a stable institution for raising children. But Tolstoy observed that marriage rarely worked as advertised. Couples who began with passion descended into conflict, resentment, and mutual exploitation. Wives became dependent on husbands economically, while husbands became dependent on wives sexually. Children were produced not from considered decision, but from uncontrolled desire. The entire arrangement trapped people in relationships based on need rather than love. He distinguished sharply between Christian love, agape, selfless concern for another's welfare, and romantic or sexual love, eros, desire for union with another for one's own satisfaction. These were not complementary but opposed. Christian love sought the good of the other and asked nothing in return. Sexual love sought possession and pleasure. You could not simultaneously love someone in the Christian sense and desire them sexually. The two impulses came from different parts of human nature and pointed in different directions. This position created obvious problems. How could humanity continue if people abstained from sex? Tolstoy's answer was radical. Perhaps humanity should not continue, at least not in its current form. If sexual reproduction required abandoning the highest spiritual principles, then perhaps the species should accept extinction as the price of following truth. Or perhaps a small number of people would reproduce out of weakness while a spiritual elite practiced celibacy. Over generations, those who could control their desires would become fewer, and eventually humanity would transcend its biological nature. He knew this sounded absurd. Critics accused him of life-denying nihilism, but Tolstoy insisted he was taking Jesus seriously. Jesus had said that in the resurrection, people neither marry nor are given in marriage. He had said that those who could accept celibacy should do so for the kingdom of heaven's sake. These teachings were usually explained away as applying only to special vocations, but Tolstoy believed Jesus meant them as ideals for everyone. The fact that most people could not live up to them did not make them less true. His own marriage illustrated the impossibility of living according to this ideal. Sophia did not share his late religious views. She had married expecting a normal aristocratic life. Instead, her husband became a religious extremist who wanted to give away their property, rejected the church, and preached celibacy, while they continued to have sexual relations and produce children. The contradiction was obvious and painful. Tolstoy acknowledged it in his diaries, expressing shame over his continued sexual desire even as he wrote about the spiritual necessity of celibacy. The tension in the marriage grew worse over decades. Sophia felt abandoned by Tolstoy's transformation. The passionate, attentive partner of their early years had been replaced by a moral authority who judged her for caring about practical matters like money and their children's future. She resented his followers, who treated Yasnaya Polyana as a pilgrimage site and had access to Tolstoy's time and attention while she managed the household. Arguments were frequent and bitter. Tolstoy blamed sexual desire for much of this conflict. He believed that if they had been able to live as celibate companions focused on spiritual growth, their relationship would have been harmonious. Sophia's perspective was different. She had not signed up to be married to a saint or to live in poverty while he gave away their resources to prove his principles. She wanted a partner and a father for their children, not a prophet. The Kreutzer Sonata created a scandal partly because readers recognized the autobiographical elements. The fictional marriage in the story mirrored Tolstoy's own in many ways. The publication required special permission from the Tsar because government censors initially banned it as immoral. Sophia was humiliated by the public discussion of their private life. She wrote her own response, a story called Whose Fault, that presented the wife's perspective on a marriage destroyed by the husband's impossible idealism. Tolstoy later wrote an afterword to the Kreutzer Sonata, attempting to clarify his position. He stated that he was not advocating for the immediate cessation of all sexual relations. That would be impossible for most people. He was pointing to an ideal that should guide behavior. People should minimize sexual activity, even in marriage. They should not marry young when desire was strongest, but should wait until they had developed self-control. They should have sexual relations only for procreation, not for pleasure. And they should recognize that complete celibacy was the highest state. This teaching was deeply at odds with both religious and secular morality of his time. The Orthodox Church taught that sex within marriage was blessed and good, part of God's design for humanity. Secular culture increasingly celebrated sexual fulfillment as essential to happiness. Tolstoy rejected both views. The Church had compromised Christian teaching to accommodate human weakness. Secular culture had abandoned any restraint on appetite, treating humans as animals whose desires should be satisfied rather than controlled. He also addressed the role of women. Much of the Kreutzer Sonata contains misogynistic rhetoric about women using their sexual power to manipulate men. In the afterword, Tolstoy clarified that he blamed both sexes equally but argued that society particularly corrupted women by training them from childhood to attract men sexually. Women's education, fashion, and social roles all aimed at making them sexually desirable. This reduced them to objects and prevented them from developing as full human beings. True liberation for women would mean freedom from this sexual objectification, which would require both sexes practicing celibacy. His position on women's roles was complex and contradictory. He supported women's education and opposed legal inequalities. He believed women were men's moral and intellectual equals, yet he often wrote about women in ways that reflected conventional patriarchal attitudes. He expected Sophia to manage the household while he pursued his spiritual work. He did not treat his daughter's education as importantly as his son's. The gap between his theoretical principles and his lived behavior was significant. Regarding homosexuality, Tolstoy shared the prejudices of his time and culture. He considered same-sex desire unnatural and sinful. This was consistent with his general view that all sexual desire was a spiritual problem, but he did not apply his critique equally. He focused overwhelmingly on heterosexual desire and marriage, treating same-sex relationships as aberrations rather than examples of the same fundamental issue. Tolstoy's sexual ethics were rooted in a deep pessimism about the body and physical pleasure. He saw the physical body as a temporary vessel for the spirit, not as good in itself. Pleasure, particularly sexual pleasure, distracted from spiritual awareness and chained people to their animal nature. This view had more in common with Gnostic and certain Eastern ascetic traditions than with mainstream Christianity, which generally taught that the body was good though fallen. His influence on sexual morality was mixed. Some followers tried to practice his ideals of celibacy and simple marriage. Most found it impossible. Gandhi, influenced by Tolstoy in many areas, also practiced celibacy and believed in restraining sexual desire. But even Gandhi's commitment to this ideal created tension in his life and relationships. For most people, Tolstoy's sexual ethics seemed not just difficult but psychologically damaging, denying a fundamental aspect of human nature. Modern readers might see Tolstoy's position as repressed, life-denying, and based on false dichotomies. The opposition between spiritual love and sexual desire does not exhaust the complexity of human relationships. Many people experience their sexual relationships as part of their deepest connections with others, not as obstacles to those connections. The integration of physical intimacy with emotional and spiritual intimacy seems more realistic than trying to eliminate desire. Yet Tolstoy's critique of how sexuality is culturally constructed remains relevant. The reduction of people to sexual objects, the commercial exploitation of desire, the obsession with romantic fulfillment as the meaning of life, these are real problems. His insistence that sexual desire can dominate lives and prevent spiritual development has truth even if his solution seems extreme. The question of how to integrate sexuality into a moral life without being controlled by it remains open. His marriage ended tragically. In October 1910, at age 82, Tolstoy fled Yasnaya Polyana secretly at night with his youngest daughter and a doctor. He could no longer bear the conflict between his ideals and his living situation. He died a few days later at a railway station, having fallen ill during the journey. Sophia was kept from seeing him until just before he died. The flight and death became an international news story, the final act in a marriage that had been both creatively fruitful and emotionally devastating for both partners. Reason and faith, two paths to truth. Throughout his life, Tolstoy struggled with the relationship between rational inquiry and religious faith. His crisis at age 50 had shown him the limits of reason. Philosophical and scientific thinking could not answer the question of why life mattered. Yet he never abandoned his commitment to rational thought. He believed both reason and faith were necessary, but he had to work out how they related to each other without contradicting each other. Tolstoy rejected the common approach that separated faith and reason into different domains. Many religious people said that faith addressed questions reason could not answer, while reason should not challenge faith on its own territory. This seemed to Tolstoy a form of intellectual cowardice. If something was true, it should be both believable by faith and defensible by reason. If faith required believing things that contradicted reason, then faith was irrational and should be rejected. He also rejected pure rationalism, the position that reason alone could determine truth, and that anything not provable through reason should be discarded. His own experience had shown him that reason had limits. When he tried to understand life's meaning through philosophical analysis, he reached conclusions that made life seem worthless. Yet he continued living, which suggested he knew something that his rational analysis could not capture. This knowledge came through faith, but not faith as opposed to reason. Faith as a different way of knowing. Tolstoy distinguished between two kinds of reason. Abstract reason, the kind used in mathematics and philosophy, operated through logical deduction from premises. It was precise and powerful within its domain, but could not address questions of value and meaning. Living reason, which he also called rational consciousness, was directly aware of what mattered. It knew without proof that some actions were right and others wrong, that life had purpose, that love was real. This was not irrational, but it was not purely logical either. Faith, in his understanding, was not blind belief in doctrines. It was trust in what living reason perceived. When you acted from love towards someone in need, you did not first prove logically that helping them was correct. You responded directly from a perception of their humanity and your connection to them. This perception was faith, trust in what you knew through immediate awareness rather than through argument. The problem was that religious institutions had confused faith with belief in specific claims about supernatural events or theological doctrines. They asked people to believe that Jesus was born of a virgin, that he physically rose from the dead, that bread and wine literally became his body and blood. These claims could not be verified by reason or experience. They had to be accepted on authority. Tolstoy considered this false faith. True faith did not require believing impossible things. It meant trusting the fundamental intuitions about meaning that made life livable. He approached the Gospels with this distinction in mind. When Jesus said, "Love your enemies," this was true because it aligned with what living reason perceived about the unity of all beings. You did not need miracles to confirm it. When the Gospels claimed Jesus walked on water or turned water into wine, these stories were either legendary embellishments or metaphors that later readers took literally. They were not essential to Jesus' teaching and might even distract from it. Tolstoy spent years studying the Gospels in Greek, trying to separate the authentic teaching from later additions. He produced his own version, the Gospel in Brief, which eliminated miracle stories and focused on ethical teaching. Critics accused him of reducing Christianity to moral philosophy and removing everything specifically religious. His response was that the miraculous elements were precisely what made Christianity seem irrational and prevented people from taking the ethical teaching seriously. He believed that reason and faith, properly understood, pointed to the same truths. Reason could show that a life devoted to selfish pleasure was ultimately unsatisfying and self-defeating. Faith provided the direct knowledge that life devoted to love was meaningful. Both led to the conclusion that one should live for others rather than for oneself. The same truth was accessible through different paths. Science presented a special challenge. In Tolstoy's time, scientific materialism was ascendant. Many scientists and intellectuals believed that only material reality existed, that consciousness was a byproduct of brain activity, and that the universe had no purpose. This worldview seemed to render human life meaningless. Tolstoy argued that science was making a philosophical mistake. It was correct about how things worked mechanically, but wrong to conclude that mechanism was all there was. He distinguished between science as a method for investigating the natural world, and scientism as a philosophy that claimed scientific method could answer all questions. Science could tell you how organisms evolved, but not whether life had meaning. It could describe brain processes, but not explain consciousness or free will. It could measure and predict physical phenomena, but not address moral questions. When scientists claimed that scientific knowledge proved life was meaningless, they were going beyond what their method could establish. Faith knew things that science could not address. It knew that consciousness was real, that you had freedom to choose your actions, that some choices were better than others. These were not scientific claims that could be tested experimentally. They were direct awareness of your own experience. To deny them because they did not fit a materialist worldview was to trust a theory over lived reality. Yet Tolstoy insisted that faith could not contradict established facts. If science proved the Earth was billions of years old, you could not maintain faith in a 6,000-year-old Earth. If biology showed species evolved, you could not deny evolution in the name of faith. The facts were facts. What faith addressed was what those facts meant and how one should live in light of them. This was a different order of question. He was critical of natural theology, the attempt to prove God's existence through rational arguments from the design of the universe or the need for a first cause. These arguments were logically weak and made God into an hypothesis to explain phenomena rather than the ground of being itself. God was not a being whose existence could be proven or disproven. God was the name for the life that animates all beings, the consciousness aware of itself through all conscious creatures, the unity underlying apparent separation. Prayer was not asking this God for favors. God was not an entity separate from you who might or might not grant requests. Prayer was aligning your individual consciousness with universal consciousness, your particular will with the will of the whole. When you prayed, "Thy will be done," you were not submitting to an external authority. You were recognizing that your individual life was part of something larger and trying to harmonize with it. Tolstoy saw reason and faith as complementary rather than contradictory. Reason cleared away false beliefs and superstitions. It showed what was logically incoherent and exposed bad arguments. Faith provided the foundation that reason alone could not establish, the sense that life matters, that you should act morally, that love is real. Working together, they allowed a person to live with both intellectual integrity and spiritual meaning. This integration was never complete in Tolstoy's own life. He continued to struggle with doubts and contradictions. Sometimes he felt certain about his religious convictions. Other times he wondered if he was deceiving himself, substituting one set of comforting illusions for another. His diaries record these fluctuations honestly. He did not claim to have resolved all questions. He claimed only to have found a way of thinking about reason and faith that allowed him to keep living with purpose. His approach influenced religious modernism, the movement within Christianity and other religions to reconcile traditional faith with modern knowledge. Modernists accepted scientific findings and historical criticism of religious texts, while maintaining that religious experience pointed to real transcendent dimensions of existence. Tolstoy was not formally part of this movement, but his work contributed to it by showing how one could be both intellectually honest and religiously committed. Critics from both sides attacked him. Religious traditionalists said he had abandoned Christianity by rejecting its supernatural claims. Secular rationalists said he was clinging to religious language for emotional comfort, while his actual position was philosophical naturalism. Tolstoy accepted that his position satisfied neither camp completely. He believed both were making mistakes, traditionalists by tying faith to indefensible claims, rationalists by thinking reason alone was sufficient for human life. The tension between reason and faith remains central to human thought. Science continues to expand knowledge of how the universe works, often challenging traditional religious claims. Yet questions of meaning, value, and purpose persist. Tolstoy's attempt to hold reason and faith together, to use each in its appropriate domain without letting either cancel the other, represents one serious response to this enduring challenge. Death and the fear that drives us. Tolstoy was obsessed with death from childhood. His mother died when he was 2, his father when he was 9. His brother Nikolai, whom he deeply loved, died of tuberculosis in 1860 when Tolstoy was 32. These losses left him acutely aware that death could come at any time and would eventually come to everyone. This awareness shaped his entire philosophy. He believed that confronting death honestly was essential to living authentically, yet most people spent their lives in denial. The death that affected him most profoundly as an adult was that of his brother. Tolstoy traveled to France to be with Nikolai during his final illness. He watched him deteriorate, struggle to breathe, and finally die. What struck Tolstoy was not just the loss, but the fact that Nikolai, who had been a conscious, living person with thoughts and feelings and memories, simply ceased to exist. One moment he was there, the next he was gone. The body remained, but the person had vanished. Where did he go? What happened to his consciousness? These questions haunted Tolstoy for years. He tried various answers. Perhaps consciousness continued after death in some form. Perhaps Nikolai's spirit lived on in another realm. But Tolstoy's rational mind could not accept this. There was no evidence for it. It seemed like wishful thinking. The more honest answer appeared to be that death was the end, that consciousness was a function of the living brain, and when the brain stopped, consciousness ceased. This conclusion was unbearable. If death was the end, then nothing in life ultimately mattered. Everything you built would crumble. Everyone you loved would die. All your efforts would be forgotten. Why struggle? Why create? Why love, if it all ended in nothing? This was the question that led to his crisis at age 50. Death made life meaningless unless there was something about life that death could not touch. His eventual answer was that your individual consciousness, the sense of being a separate self, does end at death. But this consciousness was never ultimate reality anyway. It was a temporary manifestation of something larger. The life that experiences itself through you continues in other forms. What dies is the illusion of separateness, not life itself. Therefore, if you identified with the universal life rather than the individual self, death lost its terror. This was not mere philosophy for Tolstoy. He worked to actually transform his relationship with death. He tried to see his own death not as an ending to be feared, but as a return to the source, a dissolving of the temporary boundary between self and all existence. When you died, you stopped being this particular person, but the life you were part of continued. Your consciousness merged back into the universal consciousness that had always been its ground. He knew most people would find this abstract and unconvincing. The fear of death was immediate and visceral. Abstract assurances about universal consciousness did not make it less frightening to face your own non-existence. Tolstoy acknowledged this. His own fear of death never completely disappeared despite his philosophy, but he believed the fear could be diminished by living rightly. When you lived for your separate self, pursuing pleasure, accumulating possessions, seeking recognition, your life was entirely invested in what would die. Death meant total loss, but when you lived for love, for service to others, for truth, you invested in what continued beyond your individual existence. The love you gave did not die with you. The people you helped carried forward. The truth you spoke remained true. Your individual consciousness might end, but what you had devoted your life to did not. This was the meaning of Jesus' teaching that whoever loses their life will save it. If you clung to your individual life, you lost everything at death. If you gave your life away in service, you participated in something deathless. Not because your individual soul survived, but because you had never been merely an individual. You were a temporary expression of eternal life. Tolstoy explored these themes in his fiction. The Death of Ivan Ilyich, written in 1886, tells the story of a judge who has lived an ordinary, respectable life focused on career advancement and social status. At age 45, he develops a painful illness that doctors cannot cure. Over months, he deteriorates while his family and colleagues become increasingly uncomfortable around him. Everyone knows he is dying, but no one will acknowledge it honestly. As Ivan's condition worsens, he begins to review his life. He realizes that he has lived according to social conventions without ever asking what truly mattered. He pursued success because that was what people were supposed to do. He married because that was expected. He furnished his house in the approved style. He never questioned any of it. And now he was dying, and all of it meant nothing. In his final days, Ivan experiences a profound transformation. He stops trying to deny his death and accepts it. In accepting it, he sees his life clearly for the first time. He recognizes that he caused suffering to his family by demanding they maintain the pretense that he was getting better. He feels compassion for them, particularly for his young son. In the moment of death, he realizes that death is not what he thought. He has spent his life fearing the wrong thing. What he should have feared was a wasted life. Death itself is simply a passage. The story does not explain this experience philosophically. It presents it as Ivan lived it. Readers are left to interpret what his final transformation meant. But clearly, Tolstoy was working out his own understanding of how confronting death honestly could lead to liberation rather than despair. Another story, Master and Man, written in 1895, tells of a wealthy merchant and his peasant worker who get lost in a blizzard. The merchant, Vasily, has spent the journey thinking about business opportunities and money. When they realize they might freeze to death, Vasily initially tries to save himself by abandoning his worker, Nikita, but he cannot do it. He returns, and in a moment of transformation, he lies down on top of Nikita to keep him warm with his own body. Vasily freezes to death, but Nikita survives. In dying to save another, Vasily experiences a joy he had never known in his life of selfish acquisition. These stories suggested that death was the great teacher. It showed you what mattered by revealing what did not matter. Everything you thought important, money, status, comfort, reputation, lost significance when you faced death. What remained was how you had treated others, whether you had loved, whether your life had increased or decreased the sum of goodness in the world. Tolstoy believed that fear of death was the root of much human evil. People pursued wealth because they hoped it would give them security against death. They sought power because they wanted control over their fate. They clung to nation and religion because these group identities promised survival beyond individual death. But none of it worked. Death came regardless, and the pursuit of these false securities led people to commit terrible acts, exploiting others for profit, killing for country, persecuting those of different faiths. If you accepted death, you were freed from these fears. You could act from love rather than from the desperate need to secure yourself. You could risk your life for what was right because you were not trying to preserve it at all costs. You could give freely because you were not hoarding against an imagined future. Death, fully accepted, was liberation. He contrasted two ways of relating to time. Most people lived as if they had unlimited time. They postponed important things, thinking they would get to them eventually. They tolerated injustice, assuming it would be addressed later. They delayed saying what they felt or doing what they knew was right. This attitude came from death denial. People knew intellectually that they would die, but did not believe it emotionally. Living with death awareness meant treating each day as if it might be your last, because it might be. This did not mean reckless hedonism, pursuing pleasure while you could. It meant focusing on what actually mattered. If you might die tonight, would you spend today accumulating money, pursuing status, holding grudges, or would you tell the people you loved that you loved them, help someone in need, live according to your principles? Tolstoy tried to practice this awareness. In his diaries, he frequently reminded himself that death could come at any time. He tried to live each day so that if it were his last, he would have no major regrets. This was difficult. He often failed. He got caught up in trivial concerns and forgot what mattered. But the practice of remembering death helped him maintain perspective. The fear of death was also connected to the illusion of control. People wanted to believe they could control when and how they died. They took precautions, avoided risks, sought medical care. All of this was reasonable to a degree, but it could become an obsession that dominated life. Tolstoy believed that trying to control death was futile. Death would come when it came. The question was not how to avoid it, but how to meet it. He became interested in how different cultures and religions approach death. Buddhists taught that attachment to the self was the cause of suffering, and that recognizing the impermanence of the self led to enlightenment. This resonated with Tolstoy's view that individual consciousness was temporary, and that clinging to it caused fear. Stoic philosophers taught that death was a natural process, neither good nor bad, and that wise people accepted it calmly. This also aligned with his thinking. Christianity, as institutionally practiced, seemed to him confused about death. The church taught that death was an enemy, conquered by Christ's resurrection, and that believers would be raised to eternal life. This made death into a problem requiring a supernatural solution. Tolstoy believed Jesus' actual teaching was simpler. The kingdom of God is within you now. Eternal life is living in accordance with divine love now, not a future reward. Death was not an enemy to be conquered, but a natural transition that lost its terror when you stopped identifying with the separate self. In his final decade, Tolstoy's own death approached. He was in his 80s, his health was failing, and he knew the end was near. He tried to face it as he had taught. His letters and diary entries from this period show both serenity and struggle. Sometimes he felt at peace, ready to die, confident that death was not the end of what mattered. Other times he felt afraid, attached to life, reluctant to let go. When he died in November 1910 at the railway station at Astapovo after fleeing his home, accounts suggest his final days were marked by fever and confusion. He was not fully conscious for much of the end. There was no dramatic deathbed scene where he articulated final wisdom. He simply stopped breathing, as everyone does. His body was taken back to Yasnaya Polyana and buried in a spot in the forest where he and his brother Nikolai had played as children, searching for a green stick that would reveal the secret of universal happiness. The philosophy Tolstoy developed about death was not a complete solution to death's mystery or terror, but it offered a way of thinking about death that made life more livable. If you understood that clinging to individual existence caused suffering, that what truly mattered continued beyond individual death, and that accepting death freed you to live fully now, then death became not an enemy, but a teacher. Reading life, Tolstoy's method of self-improvement. Tolstoy believed that life required constant conscious work on oneself. You were not born with a fixed character that determined your behavior. You shaped yourself through daily decisions and practices. The person you were today resulted from how you had lived yesterday, and the person you would become tomorrow depended on what you chose today. This meant that transformation was always possible but required sustained effort. Central to his method was the practice of keeping a diary. Tolstoy maintained detailed journals from his teenage years until his death, writing almost daily. These were not records of external events, but examinations of his inner life. He recorded his thoughts, analyzed his motivations, noted where he had acted well or poorly, and set intentions for improvement. The diary was a tool for self-knowledge and self-governance. Each evening he would review his day. Had he lived according to his principles? Where had he failed? Did he speak harshly to someone? Did he act from vanity or selfishness? Did he waste time on trivial pursuits? He recorded these failures honestly, not to indulge in guilt, but to see patterns clearly. By writing about his shortcomings, he made them conscious and therefore changeable. He also set specific rules for himself and tracked his adherence to them. As a young man, these rules covered everything from waking early and exercising to avoiding gambling and sexual indulgence. As an older man, the rules focused more on moral conduct: speak the truth, act from love, refuse violence, work physically each day. He rated himself on how well he followed these rules, creating a kind of daily report card. This practice of self-examination came from multiple sources. He had read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, which described Franklin's method of tracking 13 virtues and marking daily failures. He had studied the Stoic philosophers, particularly Marcus Aurelius, whose meditations showed how a powerful person could maintain constant vigilance over his thoughts and actions. He was also influenced by Orthodox Christian practices of confession and self-scrutiny, though he rejected the need for priestly intermediaries. Reading was another essential practice. Tolstoy read constantly throughout his life, but he did not read for entertainment or mere information. He read as a form of conversation with the wisest humans who had ever lived. He kept notebooks where he copied out passages that struck him as true or important. He returned to these passages repeatedly, meditating on them, testing them against his experience. He read widely across cultures and traditions. The Gospels were central, but he also studied the Stoics, the Buddhist sutras, the Tao Te Ching, the Analects of Confucius, the Hindu scriptures. and the writings of various religious reformers and moral philosophers. He was looking for convergence, for truths that appeared in different languages and contexts but pointed to the same realities. Where different traditions agreed, he paid special attention. In his later years, he compiled these readings into collections. The Circle of Reading, published in 1904 to 1905, and A Calendar of Wisdom, published in 1910, were daily readers containing selections from various sources organized by theme. Each day had readings on topics like truth, love, patience, or the meaning of life. These books were designed to provide daily spiritual nourishment, the same way religious people might read a daily devotional. Tolstoy believed that regular engagement with wise teachings was necessary to counteract the constant messages of false values from society. You were surrounded by people pursuing wealth, status, and pleasure, claiming these things made life worthwhile. Without regular reminders of different truths, you would be pulled along by the current. Reading was a way to maintain your orientation, to remember what actually mattered when the world insisted something else mattered. He distinguished between reading for self-improvement and reading for distraction. Much of what people read, novels, newspapers, gossip, served only to pass time and occupy the mind. This reading was worse than useless. It filled your consciousness with trivia and prevented deeper thought. Tolstoy was harsh in his judgments here. Even quality literature, if read merely for pleasure, was a waste. Reading should challenge you, instruct you, change you. Prayer was part of his daily practice. Though his concept of prayer was unconventional, he did not pray to an external God to request favors. He prayed to align his will with what he understood as God's will. Morning prayer was setting intention for the day. I will try to act from love, speak truth, refuse violence. Evening prayer was examination. Where did I fail? Where can I do better tomorrow? Prayer was conscious orientation toward the highest values you knew. Physical labor was also essential. Tolstoy spent time each day doing manual work, chopping wood, working in the fields, repairing fences. This was partly about self-sufficiency and rejecting exploitation of servants. But it was also about maintaining connection to physical reality. Intellectual and spiritual work could become abstract. Physical labor kept you grounded. It also tired the body in healthy ways and gave satisfaction through visible results. He believed that the body's needs should be met simply and then largely ignored. He ate a vegetarian diet, wore simple clothes, slept on a hard bed. The point was not ascetic self-punishment, but removing distractions. If you were constantly thinking about food, clothing, and comfort, you had less attention for what mattered. By simplifying physical needs, you freed mental and spiritual energy. Tolstoy was skeptical of sudden conversions or transformations. He had experienced something like a conversion in his 50s, but he recognized that changing his thinking was easier than changing his behavior. Decades after his conversion, he still struggled with anger, pride, and selfish desires. The work of self-improvement was gradual, incremental, never finished. Each day you tried again. Sometimes you succeeded, often you failed. What mattered was continuing the effort. He compared it to physical exercise. If you stopped exercising, your muscles weakened. If you stopped working on yourself, your character weakened. The default state was not stable. You were always either growing or declining. There was no coasting. This meant vigilance was required continuously, not just during special periods of effort or crisis. Community could help. Tolstoy gathered followers who shared his ideals. They discussed how to live rightly, encouraged each other, and held each other accountable. But he warned against replacing personal responsibility with group membership. Joining a community of seekers did not mean you had arrived. It just meant you had found companions for the journey. Each person still had to do their own work. He was also aware that self-improvement could become its own form of vanity. You could become proud of your spiritual progress, comparing yourself favorably to others. The diary could become a ledger of achievements rather than a tool for honesty. Rules could become rigid constraints that fostered pride when followed and excessive guilt when broken. The entire enterprise of working on yourself could subtly reinforce the ego it was meant to transcend. Tolstoy struggled with this paradox throughout his life. He wanted to improve, but he knew that the self wanting to improve was itself the problem. The separate ego seeking its own perfection was still operating from separation and self-concern. True transformation meant dissolving the ego, not perfecting it. Yet how could you work on yourself without reinforcing the very self you needed to transcend? He never fully resolved this contradiction. His method remained a kind of warfare against himself, setting rules, breaking them, judging himself, trying again. It produced both genuine progress and chronic frustration. He became a better person by many measures. He also remained tormented by the gap between his ideals and his behavior. Perhaps this tension was itself necessary. Perhaps self-improvement was not about reaching a final state, but about staying engaged in the struggle. His advice to others was to begin simply. Pick 1 or 2 clear practices, keeping a brief daily journal, reading something wise each morning, performing 1 act of service each day, and maintain them consistently. Don't try to transform everything at once. Build the habit of conscious living gradually. Over time, the practices would deepen and expand naturally. The goal was not moral perfection, which Tolstoy considered impossible. The goal was to live with awareness rather than sleepwalking through life. Most people move through their days automatically, reacting to circumstances without reflection. They said and did things without considering why. They pursued goals they had never examined. They were carried along by habit, impulse, and social pressure. Conscious living meant pausing to ask, why am I doing this? Is this what I actually believe is right? Is this serving what I value? These questions interrupted the automatic flow. They created space for choice. You might still do the same thing, but now it was a decision rather than a reflex. Or you might realize you were about to do something inconsistent with your values and choose differently. Tolstoy's method of self-improvement was demanding. It required daily discipline, rigorous honesty, and constant effort. Most people would not attempt it, and most who attempted it would not sustain it. He knew this. But he believed that for those who wanted to live deliberately rather than drift, some version of this practice was necessary. You had to actively shape yourself or be passively shaped by forces you did not control. In his final years, Tolstoy remained committed to this work despite knowing he would die without having perfected himself. The diary continued almost to the end. The reading continued. The self-examination continued. He never concluded that he had achieved what he set out to achieve, but the work itself had value, independent of results. The daily practice of trying to live rightly was itself living rightly, success or failure aside. The contradictions. When the prophet failed to live his truth. Tolstoy preached radical simplicity, but lived in a manor house on a large estate. He condemned private property but owned substantial land. He advocated giving away wealth but continued to benefit from book royalties. He preached nonviolence but expressed rage in arguments with his wife. He taught that sexual desire should be overcome but had 13 children and continued sexual relations with his wife into his 60s. He proclaimed universal love but could be harsh, judgmental, and cold to those closest to him. These contradictions were obvious to everyone, including Tolstoy himself. Critics used them to dismiss his entire philosophy. If he could not live according to his principles, why should anyone take those principles seriously? Followers were often disappointed when they met him and found not a serene sage but an old man who argued with his family, obsessed over petty disputes, and sometimes failed to practice what he preached. Tolstoy never denied these contradictions. In his diaries and letters, he acknowledged them constantly. He called himself weak, hypocritical, unable to live up to what he knew was true. He expressed shame and frustration. He envied those who seemed able to commit fully to their ideals. Yet he continued teaching and writing, insisting that the truth of principles did not depend on the imperfection of those who stated them. The deepest contradiction involved property. After his conversion, Tolstoy concluded that private property and land was theft and that living off unearned wealth was exploitation. He wanted to give away his estate, relinquish copyright on his writings, and live as a simple peasant. His wife, Sophia, refused. The estate belonged to their children. The royalties supported the family. His spiritual ideals were his choice, but he had no right to impoverish others who had not chosen them. The conflict consumed decades. Tolstoy tried various compromises. He relinquished copyright on works written after his conversion, but kept royalties from earlier books. He attempted to give the estate to the peasants, but legal and family complications prevented it. He designated parts of the estate for his children while insisting he personally owned nothing. None of this satisfied him. He felt trapped in structures he condemned, unable to escape but unwilling to accept them. Sophia's perspective was reasonable. She had married a successful author and count. She had borne and raised many children. She managed the estate and household. She copied his manuscripts. She had not signed up to be the wife of a wandering ascetic. When Tolstoy decided in his 50s that their entire lifestyle was sinful, she saw it as a betrayal of their marriage and family. She accused him of caring more about his reputation as a saint than about his actual responsibilities to his wife and children. The arguments were bitter and frequent. Tolstoy expressed frustration that Sophia cared about money and property rather than spiritual truth. Sophia expressed frustration that Tolstoy preached love for humanity while treating her with coldness and condescension. Both had legitimate grievances. Their marriage, which had begun with genuine affection, became a prison for both of them. Tolstoy's followers complicated the situation. Disciples came to Yasnaya Polyana seeking the great teacher. Some moved to the area, starting communes based on his principles. They treated Tolstoy as a prophet, asking his advice on how to live. Sophia resented these people who reinforced her husband's extremism and had access to his time and attention while she dealt with practical realities. Some followers were equally critical of Tolstoy, disappointed to find him still living comfortably while they had given up everything. Another contradiction involved his relationship with his children. Tolstoy loved his children but was often distant and demanding. He expected them to embody his ideals without recognizing that they were separate people with their own needs and values. Some children, particularly his daughters Masha and Alexandra, embraced his philosophy and tried to live accordingly. Others rejected it and pursued conventional lives. Tolstoy struggled to accept this, feeling that his children's choices reflected on his teaching. His son Lev Lvovich particularly frustrated him. The younger Lev wanted a normal life, career, marriage, social status. The older Lev saw this as spiritual failure and told his son so directly. Their relationship was cold. Years later, after Tolstoy's death, his son wrote about the pain of never feeling accepted by his father, of always being judged against an impossible standard. Violence was another area of contradiction. Tolstoy preached absolute nonviolence but expressed violent emotions. He wrote angry letters. He had explosive arguments. He was, by several accounts, capable of psychological cruelty when frustrated or opposed. He never physically harmed anyone, but his words could wound. This gap between principle and temperament tormented him. He knew that genuine nonviolence was not just refraining from physical violence, but maintaining inner peace. He failed constantly. His treatment of servants also contradicted his principles. He preached equality and rejected the master-servant relationship as exploitation. Yet servants continued working at Yasnaya Polyana throughout his life. Tolstoy personally did some work. He cleaned his room, made his bed, but the household still required servants. He tried to treat them with respect and compensate them fairly, but the fundamental inequality remained. They worked for him. He lived in comfort they provided. Regarding money, Tolstoy's position was logically coherent but practically impossible. He argued that money was a tool of exploitation, that charging for necessities was a form of violence, and that everyone should provide for themselves through their own labor. But he lived in a monetized economy. Food, clothing, and tools required money. Publishing his books required money. Traveling to advocate his views required money. He could not opt out of the monetary system individually. His call for others to do so was therefore asking them to do what he himself had not done. His vegetarianism was more consistent. After his conversion, he stopped eating meat and maintained this practice for the rest of his life. He believed killing animals for food was wrong and that humans could live healthily on a plant-based diet. This was a principle he could actually follow without depending on others' agreement. But even here, others prepared his food. The vegetables he ate were grown by workers on his estate. Complete self-sufficiency remained beyond him. The question these contradictions raise is whether they invalidated his philosophy. Critics said yes, a hypocrite's teaching is worthless. Tolstoy's response was that truth is true regardless of who states it. If someone who is drowning tells you to avoid the path that leads to the water, the advice is good even though the advisor is drowning. His inability to live perfectly according to his principles proved how difficult it was, but not that the principles were wrong. He also argued that honestly acknowledging failure was better than pretending to have succeeded. Religious leaders often presented themselves as having achieved enlightenment or moral perfection. This was dishonest and created false models. Tolstoy's willingness to admit his struggles in his diaries and correspondence showed that moral progress was difficult, that everyone struggled, that the work was never finished. This made him more relatable and perhaps more useful as a guide than someone claiming to have transcended human weakness. Yet the contradictions remain troubling. If a philosophy could not be lived, what was it worth? If the gap between ideal and reality was always vast, why strive? Tolstoy believed striving itself had value, that the direction you moved mattered even if you never arrived. A person moving from selfishness toward love, even slowly and with constant backsliding, was living better than someone who accepted selfishness as inevitable. The ideal served as a compass, not a destination you expected to reach. Some contradictions were probably necessary given the historical moment. Tolstoy was one person trying to change his life within structures built over centuries. He could not dismantle the estate system individually. He could not eliminate money from society. He could not restructure his marriage retroactively. He was caught in systems he opposed. His compromises, however uncomfortable, allowed him to keep speaking and writing, which had more impact than complete withdrawal from society might have had. Other contradictions were personal failures, his coldness to family members, his judgmental attitude, his ego disguised as humility. These were character flaws that his philosophy should have addressed, but often did not. His self-awareness about these problems did not automatically translate into changed behavior. Knowing what was right and doing it remained distinct challenges. In his final year, the contradictions became unbearable. Tolstoy felt increasingly hypocritical living in the manor house, surrounded by servants while preaching simplicity. His relationship with Sophia had deteriorated completely. She suspected him of secretly altering his will to give away the rights to his writings after his death. She searched his room, read his papers, and accused him of betrayal. He felt spied on and persecuted. At age 82, he decided he could no longer remain. On October 28, 1910, he left home secretly before dawn, taking only his youngest daughter Alexandra and a doctor. He did not tell Sophia where he was going. He intended to live out his final days as a pilgrim, wandering without destination, freed from the contradictions of his domestic situation. Within days, he fell ill. He was taken off the train at Astapovo station and died there 10 days later. Sophia arrived but was kept from seeing him until shortly before he died. This final flight can be seen as either escape from impossible contradictions or a final attempt to live consistently. He abandoned comfort and family to die as a homeless wanderer, which was more aligned with his ideals than dying in his manor house. But he also abandoned his wife without explanation and thrust his daughter into the role of caretaker during his final illness. The moral clarity of the gesture is debatable. The contradictions in Tolstoy's life do not resolve neatly. They remain messy and troubling. They show that even extraordinary insight and commitment are not sufficient to overcome the weight of circumstance, the power of habit, and the resistance of others. They also show that despite failure to live perfectly according to one's principles, a life oriented toward truth and love is different from a life accepting comfort and convention. The struggle itself mattered, even when the outcome was imperfect. Tolstoy for today, ancient wisdom in the modern world. More than a century after Tolstoy's death, the world has changed in ways he could not have imagined. Technology has advanced beyond anything he encountered. Global communication is instantaneous. Scientific knowledge has expanded exponentially. Political systems have risen and fallen. Yet the fundamental questions he addressed remain. What is the meaning of life? How should we live? What is the relationship between individual freedom and social responsibility? What do we owe each other? His critique of modern civilization applies with renewed force to the 21st century. He warned that technological progress without moral progress would lead to disaster. The 20th century proved him correct through 2 world wars, totalitarian regimes, nuclear weapons, and environmental destruction. The 21st century faces climate change, artificial intelligence, biological weapons, and surveillance technologies that could enable unprecedented control or catastrophe. Technical capacity has grown enormously. Wisdom about how to use that capacity has not. Tolstoy's insistence that violence perpetuates itself remains relevant. Nations continue justifying wars as necessary to prevent greater violence, yet each war creates conditions for future conflicts. The cycle he identified continues. Terrorism and counter-terrorism feed each other. Military interventions create the instability they claim to resolve. The assumption that problems can be solved through force, whether by states or revolutionaries, produces the same results Tolstoy predicted: temporary victories that contain the seeds of future violence. His philosophy of nonviolence influenced Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., whose movements achieved significant political changes through nonviolent resistance. These successes demonstrated that Tolstoy's principles could work at scale in the real world, not just as individual moral choices. Contemporary movements from the Arab Spring to climate activism have used nonviolent methods, though with mixed results. The effectiveness of nonviolence remains debated, but Tolstoy's argument that violence corrupts whatever cause it serves remains defensible. Economic inequality has increased globally to levels that would have appalled Tolstoy. The gap between the wealthiest and poorest has widened dramatically. His critique of capitalism and private property resonates with contemporary discussions about billionaires, corporate power, and economic justice. His insight that property ownership requires violence to maintain, through police, courts, and legal systems, applies to current debates about who has the right to exclude others from resources and space. His solution, voluntary simplicity and communal sharing, remains marginal, but his diagnosis of the problem has renewed relevance. The slavery of modern work has intensified in some ways. The typical person in developed nations works long hours, often in jobs they find meaningless, to earn money to pay for housing, healthcare, education, and consumer goods. Many people report feeling that their work serves no genuine human need but exists only to perpetuate economic systems. The disconnection Tolstoy observed between labor and life's meaning persists despite increased productivity and wealth. Some contemporary movements, advocates of universal basic income, shorter work weeks, or anti-capitalist politics, echo his critique without necessarily sharing his religious framework. Technology creates new forms of the alienation Tolstoy identified. People spend hours daily on devices, consuming content produced by distant corporations, engaging with artificial environments rather than physical reality. Social media creates the illusion of connection while often deepening isolation. Entertainment is abundant and addictive, serving the distraction function he criticized. The simplicity and direct engagement with life he advocated seem increasingly difficult to achieve in a world designed to capture attention and monetize it. His skepticism about progress applies to contemporary faith in technology. Many believe that artificial intelligence, biotechnology, or other innovations will solve fundamental problems. But Tolstoy's distinction between technical progress and genuine human progress remains valid. You can develop sophisticated AI while people remain cruel, selfish, and confused about what matters. You can cure diseases while society remains organized around exploitation. Progress in manipulating the material world does not automatically translate into progress in how people treat each other or understand themselves. Environmental destruction validates Tolstoy's warnings about the unsustainability of modern civilization. The industrial system he criticized has continued exploiting natural resources beyond what ecosystems can regenerate. Climate change, species extinction, and pollution threaten the basis of human survival. His call for simpler living, reduced consumption, and harmony with nature now appears not merely morally preferable but practically necessary. The environmental movement often reaches conclusions similar to his through scientific rather than religious reasoning. His educational philosophy resonates with contemporary critiques of standardized testing, authoritarian classroom management, and educational systems that prepare students primarily for employment rather than autonomous living. Alternative education movements, democratic schools, unschooling, project-based learning implement ideas similar to what he practiced at Yasnaya Polyana. The tension between education as development of human potential and education as training for economic productivity remains central to debates about schooling. The role of the state presents a harder case. Tolstoy's anarchism seems impractical in a world of 8 billion people requiring coordination for resource management, disease control, and addressing collective problems. Yet his core critique that states rest on violence and serve the powerful applies to contemporary governments regardless of their form. Democratic states conduct wars, maintain massive prison systems, and enforce economic arrangements that benefit elites. Authoritarian states do worse. Whether legitimate alternatives exist is debatable, but Tolstoy's refusal to grant states moral authority challenges uncritical acceptance of their claims. His views on marriage and sexuality appear dated and problematic. Few contemporary people would accept his advocacy of celibacy or his belief that sexual desire is fundamentally problematic. Yet his critique of how sexuality is culturally constructed has relevance. The reduction of people to sexual objects through pornography and advertising, the obsession with romantic fulfillment as life's meaning, the commercialization of intimacy, these are real issues. His solution may be extreme, but his identification of problems in how modern culture handles sexuality has merit. Technology and medicine have changed death in ways Tolstoy did not anticipate. Life expectancy has increased dramatically. People die in hospitals surrounded by machines rather than at home surrounded by family. Death has become medicalized and removed from ordinary life, which means most people have even less direct confrontation with mortality than in Tolstoy's time. His insistence on confronting death honestly may be more necessary now precisely because death is so hidden. The question of how to live meaningfully knowing that death is certain remains as urgent as ever. His method of self-improvement through daily examination and conscious practice has been incorporated into various contemporary frameworks. Mindfulness practices, Stoic philosophy revivals, and various self-help systems use similar techniques. Regular reflection, examination of thoughts and behaviors, gradual improvement through sustained effort. The specific religious content may differ, but the basic method of conscious self-development he practiced has proven adaptable to secular contexts. Social media and constant connectivity present challenges Tolstoy never imagined but that his philosophy addresses. He warned about the corruption of constant opinion from others, the distraction of trivial information, and the replacement of genuine thought with received ideas. These warnings apply with special force to platforms designed to maximize engagement through controversy, outrage, and superficial content. His advocacy of silence, solitude, and time for reflection stands against a culture that fills every moment with stimulation. The question of how his principles could be applied practically today remains difficult. Most people cannot simply withdraw from modern economic systems. They have families depending on them, debts to pay, and limited ability to change their circumstances unilaterally. Tolstoy's privilege as a wealthy landowner allowed him options unavailable to ordinary people. His moral demands may be true, but impossible for most to fulfill completely. Yet partial application remains possible. You can reduce consumption without achieving complete simplicity. You can refuse some forms of cooperation with violence, even if you cannot refuse all. You can work toward living more consciously, even if you remain trapped in structures you oppose. You can align your life more closely with your values, even if perfect consistency is unattainable. The question is not whether you can implement his philosophy completely, but whether you can move in its direction. Small intentional communities attempting to live according to principles similar to Tolstoy's exist throughout the world. They grow their own food, share resources, reject state authority to varying degrees, and try to live sustainably. These experiments show that alternatives to mainstream arrangements are possible, though they remain marginal. Whether they could scale to address global problems is doubtful, but their existence proves that different ways of living are viable for those willing to attempt them. Tolstoy's religious framework may be the hardest element to translate to contemporary contexts. Many people do not believe in God or any transcendent dimension of reality. Can his ethical principles stand without his theological foundation? He argued they could not, that without the conviction that life has ultimate meaning grounded in something beyond individual existence, moral principles have no binding force. Yet secular humanists and atheists who share many of his values dispute this. The question of whether ethics requires metaphysics remains open. What endures most clearly from Tolstoy is a series of questions that each person must answer. What do you actually believe is important? Does your life reflect those beliefs? If not, what would it take to bring your actions into alignment with your values? Are you living the way you would want to live if you knew you would die tomorrow? Are you contributing to human flourishing or participating in systems that cause harm? These questions cut through comfortable rationalizations and force honesty. He also offers a model of intellectual and moral seriousness. He was willing to follow his conclusions wherever they led, even when they made his life harder and more complicated. He did not adjust his principles to fit his convenience. This seriousness is rare. Most people adapt their beliefs to justify what they were already doing. Tolstoy worked backward from what he concluded was true to figure out how he should live, accepting discomfort and contradiction rather than abandoning uncomfortable truths. His emphasis on personal transformation as the necessary foundation for social change challenges both revolutionary politics and reformist incrementalism. Revolutions that do not change how people relate to each other simply replace one oppressive system with another. Reforms that leave fundamental values untouched produce only surface changes. Real transformation requires individuals changing themselves, which then changes relationships, which eventually changes institutions. This is slow and difficult, but perhaps the only path that actually works. The accusation that this focus on personal transformation ignores structural injustice has force. Tolstoy's response would be that structural change without personal change is illusory. You cannot build a just society with unjust people. The structures will eventually reflect the consciousness of those within them. Therefore, working on yourself is not retreat from political responsibility, but the deepest political work. Whether you accept his religious worldview or not, whether you think his solutions are viable or not, Tolstoy demonstrated that asking fundamental questions about how to live remains necessary. Modern life offers endless distractions from these questions. It provides ready-made answers that require no thought. It organizes itself to discourage deep reflection. Tolstoy's example shows that choosing to think seriously about what you are doing and why, refusing easy answers, and trying to live with integrity despite difficulty and failure is possible. This may be his most practical legacy, not a set of principles to adopt, but a model of uncompromising inquiry into what life demands. His final message might be simply this: you are responsible for your life. No one else will live it for you. The values you hold, the actions you take, the person you become, these are your doing. You cannot blame systems, circumstances, or other people. You have freedom, even if limited, and with that freedom comes responsibility. The question is whether you will use your freedom to live as you know you should, or spend your life avoiding that knowledge. This question applies in the 21st century as much as it did in the 19th, and it will remain relevant as long as humans are conscious beings capable of reflecting on their existence and choosing how to respond to it.